This conversation was kicked off by Deputy Administrator Heidi King back in March to raise awareness about this issue, and so I certainly appreciate her perspective and for the opportunity to sit down with all of you to continue that conversation as it adds to the national agenda. First of all, I'd like to thank each and every one of you for your shared vision in what we hold very dear, and that is what we call traffic safety. Thank you so much for what you do each and every day to continue our mission and that shared vision of zero fatalities. It's such an important conversation that we have concerning this drug-impaired driving issue. I appreciate your attendance, your expertise, and I just can't thank you enough for all the things that you do to bring this awareness to the citizens of the United States. With no further ado, I'd like to introduce our colleague, Darren Grundell. He's the director of the Washington Traffic Safety Commission. Darren, thank you for your partnership, for your vision, particularly in the drug-impaired driving arena. I know it's impacting the state of Washington and the country, so I really appreciate you hosting this and joining NHTSA in bringing this conversation to the West. I can't thank you enough for that partnership and for pulling this together with us, so thank you very much. I'll turn over to Darren. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me on the speaker? Okay. As you all know, I hate podiums, I hate tables, and I hate barriers that feel like we can't actually communicate. So I'll be out here just for a moment. But I really want to take the time to thank all of you for being here, and I really want to appreciate Deputy Administrator Heidi King for being here and joining us here in Seattle. We were back in D.C. back in March 4th, or I think it was March 15th of this year. I got kind of a separate or a special invitation for her to come out here. She had been in the kind of the call to action for drug driving, and she asked, is there anybody out there about what else we should do? And of course, you know me, I couldn't hold back, and so I just shared a few thoughts, and she said, Darren, there's an invitation in there. And I said, absolutely. Greg Ferguson and I would love to have you come out and address some of the issues that we have in our own state. Because in Washington State, we had 565 people die in on our roadways in 2017. 50% of those were impaired drivers. And a quarter of those they had multiple drugs on board. So this isn't just an issue about the legalization of marijuana. This is all an issue about impaired driving as a whole. And when you look at impaired driving, it's all substances that impair you. So that's kind of the message and some of the things that we're talking about today. I am so grateful that NHTSA is a part of this and looking at how do we partner together from the federal to the state level to be able to address the issues that many of us all have in common. It doesn't matter what discipline we're in, we're all fighting for the same thing, and that's to save lives. So, and as part of that saving lives, we know we have our own vision of Target Zero in Washington State. And we have 10 commissioners that help us to facilitate some of those efforts. The governor being the chair, or the chair of our committee. And on behalf of the Governor Inslee, I'd like to say welcome to Washington State, and for the NHTSA team, for all of you that are here and being a part of this, and for all of you that are here. I also just wanted to point out, we have Commissioner Jim Johnson over here. If you'd stand, sir. He came in this morning from Walla Walla. He's with the Association of Washington Counties and is one of our commissioners. Unfortunately, you are the only one, sir, so you're going to have to take all the heat. You already got a shirt. So we appreciate all the support from the patrol, from the Department of Licensing, Department of Transportation, the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, from the Department of Health, now with the Healthcare Authority that will be now a member of our commission as of July 1 this year. And the Department of Social Health Services is actually rotating off of our commission based on the new legislation. And then we have the Association of Cities, who I got an email last night, said she had an emergency come up and was not able to be here. But they are all thankful that you're here and supporting of your participation in this. I also wanted to, where's Kim Cheeser? Where are you? There you are. You came all the way from Delaware, just for this. And where's Jonathan Adkins from the Governor's Highway Safety Association's Executive Director from D.C.? If you'd stand and wave. And then we have lovely good friend from DC, Brandy Nanini, if you'd stand, from the Foundation of Advancing Alcohol Responsibility, or responsibility.org. We have a lot of folks here from a lot of different disciplines and a lot of different industry. We have Jennifer Cook over here from AAA, and I don't know if there's anybody else that I'm missing from kind of the private partnerships in the industry people. Brian Orsino, Law Enforcement Director from the American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators back here. And we have all of you that are here to support and represent. So today, as we go through some of the speakers and some of the data, you're going to each have a time at the end of each presentation to be able to ask some questions and to really, let's dive into this. This isn't just one of those, this is what we're doing. This is what we're doing. These are the challenges we face, and how do we work together to make those things better? So I know we have a very short time with that. They gave me 10 minutes, which was the wrong thing to do. But a couple things that I wanted to just share with you is when we look, you've heard me maybe say this before in our Washington Impaired Driving Advisory Council meetings, but oftentimes we just look at things individually. We need to look at the whole DUI program as a system. And the decisions that we're making at roadside and the field sobriety test, then we're making as far as the court and then toxicology, all those different elements, how do they impact the next system? And how do we help to prevent, like if we're doing lots of blood draws and all of a sudden giving them to the tox lab, and the tox lab's like, I don't have the equipment, I don't have the resources, I don't have the people. How do we help to prevent those kinds of backlogs and those kinds of issues through the system? So as we go through, we're going to hear a lot. We're going to hear from data. We're going to hear from public messaging and from the Liquor Cannabis Board. We're going to hear from a lot of folks from, I think Chief Sass is presenting here, Chuck Hayes from IECP. So ask the good questions. We know that there's issues. We may not agree on everything, but how do we help make our state safer? And as a result of the things that we learn here today, what are some things that the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration can take back and look at a national level? How do we replicate the great things we're doing here? Or how do they take back and say, that's not the right way to do it because of maybe some of our laws or some of the issues? How do they help to message some of those things? So the good, the bad, the ugly, and all of those is really for helping NHTSA to have that opportunity to take some of those messages back. And then lastly is, you've heard us talk about our traffic safety culture. How many of you have heard about our traffic safety culture? See, now that's a cultural shift. Because most of you, maybe years ago would think traffic safety culture, what's that? And it's a different way of approaching, instead of just the punitive, the hardcore, is how do we help to message something more positive or different? How do we address the values, the beliefs, the attitudes of individuals or a community, along with what they call the social ecology? How do we help to change people's attitudes or even what they value? Do they value their family, so they'll put their seatbelt on? Will they value their family, not drink impaired or drive impaired? Well, it's looking at those things. As we're talking about this is part of that, helping us change that cultural, the attitudes that are out there, helping to move and shift that. So when people talk about drugged driving, it becomes socially unacceptable, just like alcohol. Not where it's, I'm not really sure if it's that big a deal. They will understand that it is a big deal. We help change those thoughts and those perceptions to help us improve the safety in our roadways. So I guess, when we look at some of the things that are coming up is, for some considerations, is we've seen a little bit of a shift down in Utah with the 0.5. How will that impact? Will that impact us here in this state? What about also the expansion? Now, I'm just the messenger. Not really. I'm the one that really would like to see us as we move forward in this arena. And I know that this is not necessarily politically popular, but how do we help shift some of the expansion of the 164 funds to address impaired driving? And when you look at that statute and it talks about impaired driving, I know it defines back in the definitions to alcohol, and it says or related laws. Is drug driving part of that related laws? Are there ways? What? Yes. I'll give you a 20 after. But ultimately is how do we use those funds to address an impaired driving problem for those states that receive those to help to provide those resources that we need as a state? That's just one thing that I will just throw out as a challenge is to look at. In providing additional research on marijuana and other drugs and the effect on driving. The interview out here, I was asked that very question. You know, can you say if they were had a certain chemical level that they're impaired? We can't for marijuana. It just doesn't exist. Then the relationship between drug levels and impairment, same thing as far as some of the research. And then looking at a uniform fatality analysis reporting system list. We had an opportunity this morning to go up to the crime lab. Larry, thank you for letting us go up and seeing the lab and being a part of that and asking some good questions. And this was an issue that arose, was our fatality analysis reporting system. The FARS is how many drugs you can put in the system. It's just 3 currently, and can that be expanded to include all of those, as well as what is the quantity of those drugs? So we can start seeing nationally what those issues are in fatal crashes from the FARS reports. So just a few things just to kind of, get you, your minds moving a little bit. But I know that you're going to have a lot of questions and a lot of things that you want to bring up. And I think we're going to have some of these little whiteboards here for you to also write additional questions if we don't get to it. And with that, I have been crookshanked off of the stand. I would like to now introduce Deputy Administrator of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, Heidi King, to the stand. I think you can do your bio, but let you go.
Darren, thank you. Thank you to the Washington Traffic Safety Commission. I won't do a bio. I'll give you only the following. You have in front of the room today a group of people who care enormously about saving lives on our roadways and about the emerging problem of drug-impaired driving. Drug-impaired driving that causes deaths, injuries, property damage, risk to all of us. So I very much appreciate your leadership making me welcome here today and arranging the event. Today's event continues a national dialogue, as Darren mentioned, that we launched on March 15th in Washington, D.C. with a call to action. I'm going to note here, it's unusual for Washington to launch an initiative when we don't know what to do. We just knew that there's a problem, the problem requires a solution, and we've got to figure this out, and we've got to start now. So we launched an initiative so that we can figure out what to do, what's working and what's not, together. This meeting here today is because of what I have learned from you and others in the nation. Many of you in this room and outside of this room have shared with me the growing evidence that drug-impaired driving is a problem on our roadways. It presents a risk to the safety of our highways. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, NHTSA, one of the strangest agency acronyms I've ever heard, is an agency that is responsible for safety, for saving lives and preventing injuries. So we can't look away. It's our obligation to protect and to figure out how to save Americans on our roadways and in our communities. So already we've started to take action. We've had the call to action in March. We had a meeting last month planning as well. I'm announcing today that we have convened 2 expert working groups to begin diving into specific aspects of the drug-impaired driving problem. One of our most challenging areas is, of course, how to improve the state criminal justice system to make sure that we are adequately addressing drug-impaired driving. The second working group, toxicology and data collection. These are areas, as you know better than anyone, that are complex, intricate, and vitally important if we're going to address these risks on our highways. So in addition, we're coordinating with other entities to help us raise awareness. One of the key features here is that many folks that I hear from in our communities, and probably many folks you hear from, don't know that they are impaired when they have been, for example, smoking marijuana or using high THC products. They may not actually realize the risks on our roadways, and in some cases I hear people say they drive better. They don't drive better. So we are here to learn from you, to hear from experts how we can improve the problem. Thank you for taking the time to educate us so that we can accelerate best practice sharing across the nation, so that we can address the risks on our roadways. Today is the first of many regional meetings, so Washington leadership very much appreciated. We will today educate ourselves about the problem, share and strengthen existing best practices, many of which are here in the field in Washington. We will plan action for what to do next and identify actions that must be started now for long-term solutions. We know some of the challenges collecting high-quality tox data nationally uniform across the country may require resources and planning, so we need to start planning now. Need to hear from you what is working, what is missing, and what should NHTSA do. We are committed to the mission together. We're looking forward to looking back someday in the future at what we've accomplished together, but now let's get started. The information we hear today is important because it will allow us to form a clear vision and next steps of what to do not only in Washington, but the rest of the country. So, Washington, thank you for your leadership. Let's get started.
Thank you, Heidi. Appreciate your leadership and being here. And we actually ordered in some extra special weather just for the NHTSA team, because every time they come out, they say it's always raining. So we're going to turn the time over now to Dr. Stacy Hoff from the Traffic Safety Commission. She's our Research and Data Division Director. And then following Stacy, we'll just go right into Mary Sagawa and from the Liquor Cannabis Board into your presentation. So with that, dazzle us with your data.
Thank you. Okay. You can tell that Darren and I work very closely together because you're going to see some of my stuff repeated from his talking points that he had. You can also tell who's really influential with Darren when 3/4 of his talking points is about data, right? So I'm in his ear a lot about what's needed, what we have. But I was asked here today to answer 3 questions. What's working, what's needed, and what are the gaps? So we'll just start with that and with what's working. So anybody that has heard me speak about Washington data, and particularly about marijuana impaired driving, I always start with the message that we are here and able to talk about this issue because we have centralized toxicology laboratory. We're very unfortunate in Washington to have one lab that processes and provides the results for all of our DUI drivers, both deceased in fatal crashes, but also pulled over on the side of the road and obtained a sample by blood warrant. However, in the absence of centralized toxicology laboratories, a standardized, decentralized toxicology laboratory model would also be very effective. This includes standard operating procedures across all labs processing DUI blood samples. Standard testing panels, that's been a real issue when working with drug data, is knowing what they're testing for to begin with. You can't say a driver isn't positive for methamphetamine if you didn't test for methamphetamine. Standard reporting thresholds. In Washington State, our reporting threshold for THC, the psychoactive component impairing substance in marijuana, is 1 nanogram per mil of blood. However, I've heard other states have reporting thresholds as high as 25 nanograms before they'll report out a positive test result, which is honestly just ludicrous. Data sharing agreements. This is going to be important because you can't do anything with the data if we don't share the data. So even with central toxicology or standardized decentral toxicology, it's very important to consider the state's traffic record systems and put those data sharing agreements in place, which we have in Washington. We're a leader in being a central toxicology state and also having a very generous and wonderful partnership with our toxicology lab in terms of data sharing and information sharing. So another thing that's working well, as we've been able to demonstrate in Washington State, is our individual efforts to track the drug-to-driving issue. Again, without data, then all we have is opinions, not facts. So the problem with this, though, is we don't have any state-to-state comparisons. Even states that have compiled this information on their own are different to the point where we can't compare because of those points that I mentioned above. Testing thresholds, panels, there's differences there. And maybe if we knew what those differences were, it'd be easier to get to some of these state-to-state comparisons, which I'll talk about a little bit more. But just as an example, this is one of our very popular charts that we present and share quite a bit in Washington State. This is from our newer report on the impact of marijuana and alcohol use and fatal crashes. And the big story there is the rising incidence of polydrugged drivers. I often get the question about, are we testing more or are we testing differently? And for this particular analysis, the answer is no. This truly is a rising incidence in drivers mixing several substances and then being involved in fatal crashes. So we're very fortunate to be able to track this problem so that we can address this problem. So a couple more things that are working. Washington State Department of Health manages the Center for Disease Control Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System Survey, or BRFSS. It's a great source of information used across public health prevention efforts in a range of fields, including obesity and smoking prevention, diabetes, and now also traffic safety in Washington State. So we have a process where we are able to add state-added questions. And in 2014, when I-502 was implemented, which is what legalized marijuana in Washington State, we added a question to our BRFSS to ask respondents, how often, or have you ever driven within the last 3 hours of using marijuana? So this was one of our first sources of self-report information that we had in Washington State. The good thing about having this process is that now we have a validated question set that's gone through all the cognitive testing that is usually required to add questions to surveys such as these. So I've added that here for other states that want to use this question in their survey efforts as well. So from 2014 to 2016, these are the results of that survey. Approximately 1/3 of people who admit to using marijuana in the previous 30 days also admit to driving after using marijuana, at least once in the past 12 months. Interestingly enough, in 2015 and 2014, Washington did a roadside survey that included some self-report information, including this question, and that one also was about 1/3 of drivers admitting to do that. So we have a lot of confidence in this data and feel like it is pretty representative of the adult driving population in Washington State. The other thing I wanted to mention that Darren touched on briefly is traffic safety culture change. We have a very specific project going on in our state right now where we are surveying and developing messaging for drivers who admit to using both alcohol and marijuana and then driving. So I bring up this model. This is the model that's being used in this particular study. But one thing that's coming out as very significant is the perceived norms of people, or what people think other people are doing, has come out to be a very significant driver in terms of the decisions they make about their own actions. For example, a lot of people think people use marijuana and drive a lot more frequently than people actually admit to doing so. So this is a model that's showing a lot of promise in Washington State that we're excited about, and we'd like to see it utilized and at least talked about in other states as well. So moving on to what is needed. Fires drug driving data collection improvement. Heidi, I think you've probably heard this 100 times in your position, even before the position you're in now. And I will correct Darren, all drug results are being entered as of 2018, so that is a good improvement. But there still are some significant limitations. One of the things I think I've been most critical about with the FARS drug list, there's hundreds of drugs that we can code, but only 7 options for marijuana. Why can't we fix this one code set? It's the only drug besides alcohol that states have set a per se limit for, but it feels like we've known about for at least 5 years this is coming, and yet we have to revise all of it, or we got to fix all of this big issue, and there's some little wins, such as fixing this code set that can be done now. This is an example of how Washington State does it here on the on your guys' right, is we just use THC and CTHC, which is carboxy-THC, and then cannabinoids when we don't know either one. So it's one way to do it, but look for the little ones and make those minor improvements now. Enter drug levels, of course. This is very important. And we also need to know screening versus confirmatory. You're usually not going to get a level in screening, but you do in confirmatory. So simply by offering a drug level, we may get at this, but that's another important piece of information. We also need to centralize information for all states and for researchers on what labs are working with the FARS units, what are their standard drug panels, what are the drug reporting thresholds, and what is that state's FARS unit procedures. This information exists. It's just not centralized and shared broadly right now. So that could be another easy win. Toxicology lab support is a desperate need in an era where drug driving is increasing at the frequency that it is. We need those Buy America waivers for toxicology equipment. I know that's a heavy ask, but not all equipment is made equal. So if we don't have the right equipment, that means no data, poor data, or severely delayed data, or all 3 of those things. We've also seen research come out by Dr. Barry Logan about endorsing a national standard or guideline for DUI toxicology testing for all labs that are testing DUI samples. That would be a very good thing to provide and endorse in some way as we're going more towards maybe not centralized toxicology in every state, but decentralized standard toxicology labs. Let's provide them that standard. So traffic safety culture change. I already showed you the traffic safety culture model, but the data shows that it's time for a 0.05 BAC. My background before traffic safety was actually smoking cessation and obesity prevention. And I saw in that work how quickly the social acceptance of smoking changed dramatically overnight. And a lot of it was due from taxes and policies. The message that we would send as a nation to lower our 0.05 is overdue. It's other developed countries have done it. And if with the rising incidence of people mixing drugs with alcohol, this may work. This may work. This message may be one of those countermeasures that's going to be effective right now. This is also recommended by the National Academies of Sciences, the National Transportation Safety Board, and the National Safety Council, and has been proven effective in other countries as well. Human performance research on the impairing effects of drug combinations are needed. NHTSA has provided human performance research on individual drugs, and those are very useful documents and research, although it's getting a little dated. It's time to redo that research, but with drug combinations. Really to answer the question that we all presume to be true is that people are more impaired at lower levels of substances when they are combined. And then, of course, better and complete federal data system for all crashes. So moving beyond the fatal crashes. With vehicle technology and safety, there's very little difference between a fatal crash and a serious injury crash anymore. Sometimes it can come down simply to the year or model of the car that you drive and how safe it kept you. Therefore, to really understand the big picture, we need this on all crashes. So NHTSA has an initiative called the Electronic Data Transfer. Washington is one of about 20 states that are working on implementing electronic data transfer, which finally Washington with other states is transmitting all crashes now to NHTSA. You get more states to do that and you have a really good start to this all crash federal database that's needed. We support that. So what are the gaps? Roadside surveys. We don't have incident data anymore. Congress defunded and prevented NHTSA from spending federal funds to conduct roadside surveys, and that was a sad day. This was our only national estimate of the true frequency of drug driving, and they're gone. So if we can't change Congress's mind, what are the alternatives to conducting these roadside surveys? What else can we do? And what other support can NHTSA provide besides funding? And some ideas might be a standard and repeatable protocol that's endorsed by NHTSA, which would provide states guidance on how to conduct roadside surveys using state funding, because it's something that's desperately needed. Washington's roadside survey was one of the last roadside surveys conducted before this congressional change, and it's data that we still use today and was so important to the foundation of our messaging and getting our program off the ground when legalized marijuana came to our state. FAR's drug driving data use and publication. Despite the limitations of this national data, particularly around drug driving research, it's still the most used source of drug driving crash information in the published literature. Oftentimes when this issue comes up, NHTSA researchers, specifically Dr. Burning and Dr. Smithers, who published this great research note, thoroughly describing the limitations of this data, this document is not made available on some key sites where researchers are accessing FAR's data. So the FAR's Analytical Reference Guide is essentially the data dictionary for researchers, yet this publication is not mentioned or cited there. The FAR's FTP download site, where researchers go to actually access FAR's data, this documentation is not provided there. And on NHTSA's drug impaired driving webpage, this is also not provided there. So I think there's some opportunities to really highlight this article and start shifting the landscape of the research that we see around there around drug impaired driving to really strengthen it, or at least understand the limitations of doing that research better so that we can make better informed decisions on how to interpret that information. And then it's a use of other traffic records data for national crash surveillance. Of course, we have FARS and systems like CRIS, the Crash Representative Sampling System, and others. But what are the national traffic records core data systems, such as what is our source for national court data? States are expected to identify core traffic records data systems, yet we haven't seen that identification happen at the federal level. So drug impaired driving versus drug positive driving. This is a gap, this is an issue. I'm not going to spend too much time on that because I think everybody struggles with this one. Are we trying to stop impaired driving, or are we trying to stop general drug use, which is the difference between drug impaired and drug positive? Or maybe we're doing both. Maybe there's opportunity with prevention and traffic safety to combine our efforts and prevent both. DUI alcohol versus DUI drugs versus DUI alcohol and drugs. There's a million combinations I think that we can come up with on what you can be impaired by at one time. So we definitely need a central data collection effort on DUI arrest, including the evidential toxicology results. This will fuel some of the research that's needed in the human performance areas. Mental health and substance abuse treatment, dual diagnosis data. We spent a lot of time in our agency talking about how dual diagnosis, or the diagnosis of a substance abuse issue with a mental health issue, and how they intersect and feed on each other, and these are people that end up in our impaired driving population. So until we get at the root cause issue, and particularly the issues with dual diagnosis, how are we going to impact in a meaningful way the issues we see with impaired driving? Traffic records data integration may help with this, but it's important to have data to really understand the impact this has on traffic safety. So with those messages, I will turn it over to my colleague, Mary Sagawa, for her presentation on prevention efforts. And thank you very much.
All right, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. And I especially appreciate following Stacy, because the work that she's doing in data collection and data analysis really makes a difference for us in the directions we go and what we do when we start talking about education and awareness. So what I want to do, though, is move up to kind of a higher level and look at what are some of the key concepts when we talk about education and awareness, and we talk about what's working. We also move back a little bit from the intervention, what happens when people are arrested, when they have problems, but how do we keep them from getting into that situation where they're using and abusing and getting on the road and causing problems for all the rest of us. So as I look at this, the key concepts that we do is we make sure that collaboration and coordination are part of everything. We have a number of agencies who work together to further these messages of prevention, of education, and awareness. We have our Washington Healthy Youth Coalition, which focuses on prevention of underage use and abuse, and we have a lot of state partners that work with us, including the Traffic Safety Commission on that, so that we can coordinate what we're doing, that what we do engages stakeholders whenever possible. When we're doing education messaging, we need to know who the audience is and what will resonate with them. Sharing the resources so that everything that we create can be shared with our partner agencies. We also have the Strategic Prevention Enhancement Consortium, which is also made of a number of agencies and statewide organizations that goes higher level beyond just youth, but adult use and looking at both behavioral and mental health issues. Move this down just a little. So as we build these assets, we want to make sure that we can share them statewide and that our community coalitions and our other organizations across the state and individuals can use these, that we're making the best use of state resources and having a consistent message. So what I want to do is, I'm going to focus primarily on what we've been doing in the area of marijuana education, because I think it's a good example of agencies working together, of having funding that supports messaging not just once a year, but throughout the year, and continued funding. When Initiative 502 was passed, one of the things that it included was specific funding that would continue for areas of prevention, treatment, and surveillance. These are the amounts that have been allocated for for the fiscal year 2019. One of the unfortunate pieces of this is that the original initiative had percentages of revenue that came in, so that the amounts would increase as we went along. And unfortunately, the legislature saw that there was funding that could be used in other areas of need, so they removed the requirement for percentages and did flat funding. So some of these amounts, unfortunately, are not changing year after year, are not increasing. However, on the other hand, this is more money than we've had, and it's nice to have that stable funding that continues so that we can do campaigns that are not just a one-time hit and then move on. We know that when we do media campaigns and awareness campaigns, they also have to be paired with other things that are happening, other prevention aspects, whether it's best practice curricula, whether it's working in the schools, that it's the pairing of all of these techniques that really have the best effect. So using this, I wanted to give you some examples of the activities that are being funded. One of the key ones is the support that goes in for 64 community coalitions, and this is through what's now the Healthcare Authority, was DSHS, Division of Behavioral Health and Recovery, which, as Darren said, moved to Healthcare Authority. So there are 64 community coalitions that are getting some direct funding and support for the work that they do. There are also community grants that go out to the 9 health regions in the state and 5 priority population contractors. So we don't just do the one-size-fits-all, but the priority populations that focus on ethnic populations, the GBLTQ community, and that we give this funding supports all those, and techniques are developed to address their needs specifically. We also, as you'll see on this, in addition to social media has been the most effective because it has the broadest reach, but for some populations, we also do things like ads in the theaters and billboards. And again, we have a group of agencies who work together to vet this, to look at what we're doing, to give feedback, as well as getting the stakeholder input. You can see one of the things on here is the poster for there can be no excusing driving after cannabis using. It's a crime, a bad decision, you could cause harm or a collision. This was the result of some stakeholder input that said, and this was users of cannabis who said they like the rhyming thing. And so ads were developed with the rhymes in mind. Here's some other, I know it sounds a little funny, but it works. Here are some other examples. Our Learn About Marijuana website that is funded with the prevention funding, the marijuana dedicated funds. There's a youth campaign. It started out as Note to Selfie, remember what's important and forget marijuana. And again, various methods to get that message through. And now we've kind of changed that to you can, marijuana can't, and it focuses on what you can do on your own and how marijuana can get in the way of your goals. Toolkits for both the broader community and for tribal prevention and wellness programs. So to get a little more specific, then our Department of Health gets the funding for the marijuana campaign, and they have put that into 3 buckets of varying sizes that you can see. The adult education campaign, which just launched in the last few months, focuses on the adult consumer of marijuana. And the 4 areas, the main areas of focus are the drug driving, marijuana use by pregnant and breastfeeding women, and then the message to lock it up. And again, all of this serving to make things safer, that if you're going to use, know what the risks are and use in a way that you reduce those risks. The young adult prevention and education, we want to emphasize the 18 to 20-year-olds, and so we're now in the formative research on that to figure out what will work best for them. And then the youth prevention has been the biggest piece, and this also includes a focus on parents, that parents need to be talking to their kids, they need to realize that their youth do listen to them. And again, these are general campaigns plus the tailored media campaigns. Other efforts that I wanted to mention beyond what is happening in the world of marijuana is the underage drinking campaign that was done through DSHS and again now Healthcare Authority this past year, and it focuses on social norms, targeting the high school teens and their parents. And what they did on this is they tried to, again, look at those messages that say, most kids are not using, most teens are not using. They wanted to get the message, and this was specifically for alcohol, so take alcohol out of the picture, and you can do all kinds of things with alcohol out of the picture. And then for parents, telling them looks can deceive, that your kids are listening to you. The opioid abuse prevention campaign, money was gotten this past year to focus on opioid use. They have 3 areas there. 1 act of courage for youth to make the right decision and to get help if they need it. 1 honest conversation focused on parents to talk with their kids. And then 1 simple step which promotes safe storage and disposal of opioids. I also wanted to mention that policy work is also a part of education, and that when we require labels on the marijuana edibles that say it is illegal to operate a motor vehicle under the influence of marijuana, it's another way to say stop, look, listen, this is important. There are other things that are happening in communities, things that groups have taken on individually. Not enough time to go through all of that. I do want to recognize Linda Thompson is in the audience, and the victim impact panels are another method of education. So then briefly, this is a Seattle Times takeover, where you can see where their ads are all around about your kids. They may not look like they're listening to you, but they are. So some needs and gaps. Additional resources are always a piece. I think we always say we could use more money, we could use more staffing. But part of this, I think, is to relate to all educational efforts. A lot of times money comes into specific pockets, or can only be used for this or used for that. And sometimes when we spend all our time looking at marijuana, we take our eye off the ball on what's happening with alcohol. And we really need to be looking across the board, what are the messages that resonate? And I think with our Start Talking Now for parents, we do that. Additional research, we've already heard about that, that's pertinent, that looks at the potency levels of marijuana that are out there right now to make better decisions on how our money needs to be spent. For communities to use the assets that are being developed. We can develop all kinds of things for them, but it's great when they can take that, put their community stamp on it, and move forward. And then more messaging aimed at the use of multiple substances. You've heard about the problems with the co-use of marijuana and alcohol and getting out on the road, and we need to coordinate that better and get more messaging out in those areas. So in summary, basically, I think what I need to emphasize is that when you talk prevention and education, it's not one thing, one size fits all. You need to look at your audience. You need to use different methods of getting the message out. And it's important to talk about behavior in the broader sense. It's not just one substance that's causing the problem. We have a number of substances that are causing the problem. So thank you to our partners who have helped work on this, especially the Traffic Safety Commission, and we look forward to continuing this work. Thank you.
Now I'd like to open up our panel to questions. Do we have a microphone in the field? If you have a question of the panelists, please raise your hand and we'll get a microphone. Oh, I'm sorry, I could have. Good, thank you. Any questions of our panelists? While people are thinking about it, oh, please, right here.
Linda Thompson, Greater Spokane Substance Abuse Council in Washington. Association for Substance Abuse and Violence Prevention. My question is about the working groups with the call to action. We often have groups that work on these issues but don't have those who've been affected. Are there families or survivors of crashes that are involved in the working groups to bring that perspective to the table?
We'll be posting online more information about the groups. At this point, because the groups are focused on very much the technical scientific information, my last look at the participants that are launching the groups, it included PhD toxicologists and statisticians. But that's a brilliant idea, and as we move particularly more into community impacts and communication, we absolutely will be engaging the families of victims, communities, those impacted. Thank you.
Any other questions of our panelists? While you're thinking of some, let me throw one out and we'll prime the pump that way perhaps. Dr. Hoff, you were asked here because you're a leader in your field of data collection, and what do you do that is different from others?
I'm not super clear on what others are doing, so that's hard to compare ourselves, to others. But I can say that when we saw the legislation coming for legalization of marijuana, obviously no other state had experienced that before Washington and Colorado had. So being in the little unit that I was, one thing I guess that we did differ is we already had central toxicology, so we were already set up. We had all of the records because we were already coding the FARS record. The only difference was they were on paper. So I guess that's what I say when people say, how did you get this information, is we saw the need when it was coming. We got the information. We got approval from our supportive director for an overtime project. And we abstracted all that data in absence of an IT solution. And we continue to do that today, where we work with State Patrol Toxicology Lab for the IT solution. So that's one big thing that we maybe did different, is we saw the issue and we solved it.
Got ahead of the curve.
Got ahead of the curve.
Thank you very much. Questions from the field? Yes, we have one right here.
I'm Brandy Nanini from responsibility.org, and one of the things that we hear from lots of different states is the problem and the backup that it creates on the toxicology labs. And so from your perspective, I wanted to hear some of the challenges and how you overcame them with that, and what your advice would be for other states that can see it coming but don't have to deal with it quite yet.
We didn't have a significant backlog before, but we do now. So I'm actually going to defer until Dr. Peterson discusses toxicology in the afternoon. She's going to be better to answer that question about impact on the lab than I am.
Questions? Yes.
I'm Amy Friedheim of the King County Prosecutor's Office. I'm the Senior Deputy Prosecuting Attorney in felony traffic. And my question has to do with per se drug driving states versus our state, which is an affected by drug state. And have you seen differences in use, in how those states cope, or how they are affected by their results in drug driving versus, do I need this?
No, Amy, you don't.
Were you able to hear me? Do you understand my question?
I do.
It's about the per se drugged driving versus affected by drug driving. Our state isn't affected by drug driving, so you can have methamphetamine in your system and kill people.
Right.
It's not a vehicular homicide.
Yeah, we know.
So the question is whether or not you have done any research or there comparisons with states that have per se drug driving.
For me personally, what I know, it's a little too early because the adjudication process takes a long time. So some of these drug driving cases, even before legalized marijuana, but it's with marijuana that we have that per se. It's a huge national discussion about should there be a per se, and if so, what should it be? I don't know that it's necessarily a deterrent. If that's what you're asking, some of the data that I've seen around drug driving, whether it's available, it really is independent of whether they have a per se law or not. But maybe Heidi, do you have something to add from the national perspective on that issue?
As far as sort of statistical analysis, I haven't seen one. I know we're looking at it, but because there are so many social factors changing, the dramatic rate of change of the social acceptability of the use of illicit drugs, the availability, removing the kind of market barriers to access, we're seeing so many things change at the same time, it'll be difficult to tease out statistically, but we are very interested in watching the natural experiment of different policies at the state level. That being said, don't want to watch too long, need to figure out what we need to do. It's a good question.
Question?
Hi, I'm Brianna Peterson from the State Patrol. I had a question about, for alcohol, did they find it effective to do education versus just prevention for youth? So I noticed in your 3 tiers that education only goes under people who are legal to use marijuana versus kids are driving for 6 years and we're creating this culture, and if they use marijuana illegally and think I'm a safer driver, how are we going to change their perception once they're 21 if we're only using prevention measures versus education? So I don't know if that can correlate to what was done in alcohol.
So very good point. I think one of the difficulties has been that a lot of the funding has been specifically for prevention on underage use. And we do need, that is one of the gaps, that we do need more education. One of the areas that we are working on right now is what messaging resonates with the college-age population. We are finally doing better research, getting better information with surveys of college students, so we can use some of that information. It's a gap, and I think we know that if we can stop youth from using before the age of 21, they are less apt to have problematic behaviors with substance use. And so that is, looking at trying to keep them from jumping in the river and going over the waterfall instead of pulling them out after they've gone over the waterfall. But I think you've made a very good point in the need to do more education later. And even older adults. We're seeing the data show that women are increasing their alcohol intake, especially older women. And we really have not put efforts in that area yet. And a lot of it is a funding and resource issue.
Can I just go back to Amy's question really quick? I think in regards to the nanogram level and the per se limits.
I'm talking about per se, period.
Right.
So, methamphetamine, the parent drug, cocaine, THC. I mean, we do have per se levels for alcohol and for THC within 2 hours, but I'm talking about across the board drug per se levels for Schedule I drugs.
Well, I think it's going to be interesting as we see in time. Yeah, I think it'll be interesting when you look across the country and you see this patchwork of legalized, decriminalized, what's the rules for that? Is it a per se? Is it any traceable amounts? All those differences. I think in time we'll be able to see what are those differences. So right now, like in some of the courts, if a prosecutor gets a case that comes in and it's a 3 nanograms and they can show impairment, will they prosecute that case? Will it move forward? Or will they only need to be able to have it for us for the per se limit at 5 nanograms and above? And right now, the way that our system's set up, we can't really pull that data and extract that and analyze it, to see. But I think over time, when you see states like Oregon that decided not to put in a per se limit, I think we're basically a 0 state. You have states like Massachusetts, it's 1 nanogram or 2 nanograms. I think it's one of those. And then you see these others. What are those differences as far as prosecution? Is it a deterrent? Do people say, you know what, well, if I can get up to 5 nanograms, then hey, it's like alcohol. Why do we let people get up to the legal limit?
You call it a legal limit.
Right. Well, and that's part of I think the issues that we have to educate the public on is, well, it's the legal limit. Well, is it a legal limit? Is it a per se limit? And do they even know the differences? So, but I think ultimately back to your question is in time is seeing what is the greater deterrent, if there is one, and what will the impacts be, especially with the 0 tolerance law, or with ours as a per se limit. So,
Mary, I have a question for you. What do you need at the national level to help you do your job?
I think that the support given to the Washington Traffic Safety Commission to be partners with other agencies in the work that we are doing. They have a small staff, they're a small agency, and sometimes when they are invited to sit with us, their resources are stretched really thin. And I think supporting them to be with us, I did not talk specifically about some of their education campaigns because I felt like this audience was more aware of those already, so I did not include those. But I think the campaigns that they are doing, things like Drive High and Get a DUI, when that started, that if we can work more closely together and help get those messages out, get those assets out to communities, and then the support for communities to have the funding to do their own messaging in their communities, it expands it significantly. So I think that would be an important piece of it. And continuing the grant funding that is available for traffic safety to give out to communities. I know communities have benefited greatly for that. As other resources have dwindled, those kinds of resources become more and more critical.
Thank you. In your mind, what is the biggest outstanding need that you have?
In my mind. Okay, personally or as an LCB person? I think, because I have to say, sometimes what I say is my personal opinion. I think the biggest piece from an LCB perspective, as I look at what we're doing across the state, is helping communities get better engaged in policy making and providing input on policies, because those policies have a key effect on what happens on the road in our communities. With the funding that some of our coalitions are getting, whether it's Drug-Free Communities money at the federal level or it's state monies, they are feeling restricted on what they can do in terms of advocacy because of that line between advocacy and lobbying. And how can we better support them to have a voice in the policy making that we are doing? And from the work that I do at the Liquor and Cannabis Board, there are times where I see policies that could really benefit from that prevention, public health perspective to make things safer for everyone. And we're not hearing from our partners as much as we would like to. And I'm not putting it on them. I think it's on all of us to better support them to be able to do that.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Dr. Hoff, let's talk about your biggest need. And if you describe the biggest need that you have, and what are you doing right now as a stopgap to meet that need until we can realize something?
I need FARs to be fixed. is probably the biggest need for not just me, but any analyst in other state. Those state-to-state comparisons and really just trying to monitor what's happening nationally is going to be really important. And then, of course, you all know what we're doing as a stopgap is we have our own drug data system that we do take FARS elements with, and then we marry it back up with FARS because there's a lot of good information in FARS, just not the drug driving information isn't great. So certainly that's been our priority. I'm the FARS supervisor, so of course that's my priority, is to see those improvements come quicker than they have been able to come so far for the benefit of our state and all other states. And then of course, in the absence of that, we'll just continue abstracting our own information.
You bet. Thank you very much. Any other questions from the field?
May I?
Absolutely, please.
So I'd like to ask a question of Mary. I don't know how the state of Washington educates its new drivers. One of the things that has terrified me since I came to NHTSA is that, unlike when I was young, hundreds of years ago, when everybody in high school took driver's education and we would all learn about risk as well as responsible behavior, now I understand in many areas of the country, people are not taking that step. How does Washington educate its new young drivers? And have there been efforts to reach them at that point of education that you can recommend to other states?
The Department of Licensing handles the licensing of new drivers and the education programs, and a lot of those are done via contract with private organizations, private groups, but they do have specific curriculum that needs to be included. And that is one area that we just recently, and this was probably short-sightedness on our side, we have not had them as a partner at the table very long, but it is a piece that we're learning more about what they're doing. We're looking at how we might um, infiltrate, you might say, how we might get better messaging, prevention messaging within that curricula. And so it's a work in progress right now that I would hope within a year, we'd have a much better answer to that question to say, here are the things that we're doing. And I'm seeing that there's somebody in the audience who might.
So, Bill, could you pass the mic over to over here to Angie Ward? I think that you're right on, Mary, and I think Angie's.
Thank you for asking that question. Driver education and how we test in Washington is really going through a major overhaul. Our Department of Licensing is being very brave right now in how they are really taking a hard look at that whole process. In answer to your question about impairment-related issues, we actually just funded them 2 years ago, the Department of Licensing, to revamp the driver's guide and curriculum to make sure that it was including the best possible information. That said, I would say that when you look at what our driver's guide looks like, it's this thin, and when you take a look at the curriculum that we require in the United States, not just in Washington State, it's really kind of a systematic problem, I would say, when you think about all the effort that we're putting into fixing the problem of impairment once people get that driver's license, which I don't call it a driver's license anymore, I call it an ID card. Because really, when you look at real ID and the things that are important, getting your driver's license in the United States is very much a right, from my perspective. It's not a privilege. And so it feels like we're having to put so much time and energy and money into fixing not just the impairment problem, but all the driver problems we have because there isn't enough focus placed on how we get that driver's license in the first place. That said, when you look around the world, we're really challenging ourselves to look around the world at how people get their driver's licenses. And again, I think the Department of Licensing and my agency, the Traffic Safety Commission, were very forward-thinking in sending a few of us to the UK a few years ago to look at what they do. We can't transfer what they're doing there, but there are some really solid things that they do in regards to not just impairment, but all of the entire driver's licensing system, and it really is a system in most of the other countries that are doing better than us. So I will say that licensing is doing a great job. We have aligned it with the Target Zero. It was the money that we gave them, the highway safety money that they gave them, was to align the curriculum and the driver's guide with Target Zero to make sure that they were spending better time or more time on impairment issues. So it's being done, but there's so much more we could be doing. And I'd love to talk to you more about some of the work that we're doing in that regard.
So specifically for Angie is in the driver's guide, there's information on marijuana and the increase in the impacts. And then there was also questions added to the actual driver's exam.
Oh, good.
Yeah, there were questions. That was part of the grant, is that the guide, and then there was additional questions addressed for marijuana on that. And also, we added some questions on distracted driving in that exam as well. So anyways, I'll turn it back to you, Greg. I think there's a question here.
I think also, just to add to that, one of the other areas that I think we can take advantage of is that parents need to be involved in driver education. So how can we, with this captive audience, how can we better educate those parents? Because again, they are the #1 influence on their kids' decisions when it comes to alcohol and other drugs.
As kids are with their parents.
Yes.
So again, Linda Thompson, I let everybody know who I'm with, but most important role I am is the mother of a 3-year-old son killed by a 17-time repeat drunk driver 32 years ago, and got into prevention. And one of the things I really appreciate what Mary said about policy and about awareness. And this is a brochure that we picked up at my hotel this morning. It's the Washington Beer, Home of the Hops, Your Guide to All Things Beer in Washington State. It's about a 20-page brochure. It has maps of every brewery in the state who's part of this. There is not one word about don't drive impaired. It talks about bring your kids, bring your dogs, you can drink all you want, basically, at all these places. And the alcohol industry has its way with our legislature. I just think that we try to talk to them about trying to raise the taxes on alcohol, to have it go back into prevention, and the lobbyists are everywhere. We were trying to do medicine take back. There were 24 pharmaceutical companies on the Hill lobbying against that bill against us. There are all kinds of things that we need in public policy, and it is investment back into prevention. We can do education. We do a 24-hour jail alternative program in Spokane County in partnership with Geiger Correction Facility, and that was last Friday. I had 22 first-time offenders of DUI in the room, and they're there from 7 in the morning till 7 the next morning, and they get their alcohol drug information school, their DUI victim panel, and get 24 hours served in the visiting center out at Geiger. There were 22 people, did I say 22 people? 17 of them had a BAC over a .18, and they were first-time offenders. And most of them talked about having beer and shots. And the marketing of shots and the way that the industry or the bars are marketing shots and mixing that, I think there has to be something done about this free marketing, just go crazy with shots and alcohol in bars. And when we talk about driver's ed does a great job, but these people are 22, 23, 28 years old. They had driver's ed a long time ago. And we're not doing awareness among the general population about what can happen when you drive impaired. People say, well, I refused because a friend of mine told me to put a penny in my mouth and refuse. Those things don't work, but they thought it was the best way. And so somebody's teaching them something, and it's just not us.
Thank you. Courtney, did you?
I was just going to say that we have, I'm one of the TSRPs. We have 4 in Washington, so, you know. But I'm also on the Mad Washington board now, and I would say that for the last 4 years at least, we've been invited to speak at and I can never remember what the acronym is, but because it's mostly private educators, so we've been invited to speak at their conference about impaired driving, so I think that's another, they have that in every state, so that's been a good avenue. Miriam went one year, and it's another, they're very interested, and they're, like Angie said, what they've been given as curriculum on their end is very sparse. And then I know that's been something that those, related, but is people getting their motorcycle certification, which we all know, of course, a huge area that's not improving / getting worse, is they also have interest, I think, in more partnerships with us to get better information. Because I know when I took it, I was like, so could I, just address the class as well and give you actually good information? So there's not a lot of that, but I think we're building those relationships. Professional Driving School Association, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions of our panel?
Greg, may I ask one? Maybe it's a closing question?
Absolutely.
For
Please.
Dr. Hoff, so while we change and improve the data collection systems, which we're committed to doing, but it takes time, so of the data that we have now as a nation, what do you recommend as data we can rely on in shaping our policy decisions in the near term while we're improving data that will shape policy decisions in the future?
I think I mentioned that there's a need to share that central information about what individual states are doing, what tox units they're working with, what the procedures of those toxicology panels are. In the absence of national data, you have some really good states that are geographically diverse and representative. I know that, I hope I get this right, West Virginia, I think, has a very similar robust drug driving testing environment and data collection like Washington does. So, I mean, there's a West and an East right there. Mm-hmm. So find out which states are doing it well and who have that information and start with them. We have lots of statistical procedures to do sampling methods and things like that when you don't have everyone. So we've got a lot of opportunity there. And then also just keep in mind when we're fixing FARs, take advantage of those short, easy wins. Let's at least revise that marijuana drug list as soon as possible while the bigger revisions continue to occur. Thank you.
Thank you.
Could we give our panel a hand, please? Dr. Hoff, Mary Sorrell, thank you very much.
We're going to turn the time over to Moses Garcia, and then following him will be Chuck Hayes from the International Association Chiefs of Police, DRE program, or the DEC program. And then following Chuck, we'll go right into Chief Jeff Sass from the Washington State Patrol's Field Operations Bureau. We'll go on that, and then we'll do very similar questions answers right after that. So with no further ado, Moses.
Thank you. They put me first, I'm sure you're aware, because the gentlemen with guns come after me, and they're quite guarded about their time. So I have exactly 10 minutes, I'm told. My name is Moses Garcia. I am a prosecutor. I spent 24 years doing prosecution-related work. My current role is as a TSRP. We've introduced already the 3 TSRPs that guard the state. They work with judges, law enforcement, they work with hearing examiners, probation officers, they work with victims advocates, DOL, the legislature. The list is as long as the occupations of the people in this room. Our role is to try to form a deterrent to either committing the crime, if you are charged, to making sure that you are convicted, and if you are convicted, to make sure that you serve the maximum amount of punishment necessary for that circumstance. If we're not able to fulfill those 3 roles, then the prosecutor's role is dramatically undermined, and deterrence results in fewer and fewer convictions and less belief in the public that they can be held accountable for what occurs when they drive either impaired by drugs or alcohol. The first question we were asked was, what is working? Unfortunately, the prosecutors don't really have good metrics. And so what I'm going to rely on is, what was it like when the TSRP program began? So it's an 8-year-old program. It began in September of 2009. We had 1 person statewide that was available to prosecutors whose job it was to provide that training and technical support. We expanded that through the Traffic Safety Commission to 3. But more importantly, these were TSRPs whose whole job was to support traffic-related crimes. Pamela Jinsky, God bless her, had every other thing. Now, since that time, we've been able to expand to 4. And when I say we've been able to, I mean virtually everybody in this room contributed to the success of the TSRP program. We are currently the largest TSRP program in the nation. We are also in the top 3% in terms of productivity. I think by any metric that you can use, the Washington TSRP program is a success. That being said, any successful program, I think, shares all the same qualities. It depends on the partners that are in it with you. We could not be successful without a very, very strong Traffic Safety Commission. We could not be successful without the support of NHTSA, making the TSRP program of best practices. We couldn't be successful without the continuing mentorship and support of the Washington State Patrol, the toxicology lab, the impaired driving section, the director of FLSB. We couldn't be successful without the support of our legislature in crafting laws that are responsive, the victims' rights organizations that are at the table with the Washington Impaired Driving Advisory Council. So when I say the Traffic Safety Resource Prosecutor Program is successful, I'm saying the entire system works. It works because we are collaboratively looking at the problem. We regularly meet, and there are very few people in this room that I don't know on a first-name basis. And that's saying something, because I regularly forget my daughter's names. So I know there are things we need to improve upon. One of those things that we need to improve upon is the reality is that we get a lot of cases that are sent out to prosecutors who, in my estimation, do not have the minimum qualifications to try a DUI case. The reality is that many DUI cases are more sophisticated, more complex, and more challenging than a murder case. I'm talking about a DUI. I'm not talking about the tragic circumstance of a vehicular homicide or a vehicular assault. I'm talking about the standard DUI. The complexity of the science the physics, the optics, the complexity of balancing the schedules of a toxicologist in a blood case or refusal. These are things that are well beyond the capability of most lawyers, not to mention prosecutors. And when I see a prosecutor in the courtroom who has not even graduated law school, who is trying a DUI and is clamoring for assistance, we will do what we can, but trying to cram years of information into that prosecutor's brain in that short a period of time, it's very, very challenging. The other major challenge there is the sophistication of the information. I don't care if you've been practicing for 10 years. I know that every TSRP I work with regularly gets calls from felony level prosecutors who are stuck with very elementary issues. They simply don't have the experience to be able to tackle these things. And our concern is that for everyone that does call out to us, there are many, many more who do not. And we see the consequence of that in both the conviction rate and in the charging rate. It is heartbreaking to see cases that result in either reductions or dismissals or not guilties because they are simply not able to challenge the defense. The defense in Washington, we are both blessed and cursed with a very active, very sophisticated defense bar. Because of that, we have seen the challenges that many states never ever see. And everybody knows that if you expect to get good at what you do, you need to be regularly challenged. And so our blessing is we are regularly challenged. The unfortunate part is that many times that mismatch occurs in a courtroom on a DUI. When you have a 20-year veteran of DUI defense facing an intern or a first year, it is a mismatch that is likely to end badly for the prosecution in that case, for the victims, for the system. If we can't convince the public that we can get a conviction if charged and that we can get punishment, then there is no threat. People will believe that they can drink without a significant consequence. That's the disaster. There are some gaps, and I think I've alluded to one of the primary ones, is there's very little in the way of metrics on the prosecution side to be able to tell me what was that case about, what drugs were involved, why was the disposition, what was the disposition. That's just globally, I cannot tell you that. I can tell you how many DUI cases were charged in Washington, and I can tell you how many of them were convicted or pled. I can't tell you whether it was alcohol or drugs. I can't tell you whether or not, if it was drugs, what drug. I can't tell you the levels, the concentrations. I can't tell you anything about that case other than that. We also have room for improvement in the area of criminal history. Of course, between states, it's very, very bad. Getting a judgment and sentence from California or Texas would be a miracle. And I regularly, and I know my fellow TSRPs do this, we reach out across state lines to make person-to-person phone calls to see if we can get the document. Because without that document, I can't even charge a felony-level DUI. If I can't prove that this person has priors from this other state, I have to charge them as a DUI, and this person should be going to prison, not jail for 30 days. But even within our own state, we have a poor reporting system that doesn't allow me to see what a judge put in terms of probation demand, that they may not refuse a BAC, that they must drive with an ignition interlock device. When those things are discretionary as opposed to mandatory, very, very often, even within the same jurisdiction, it's impossible to know what that court ordered. My time is over, but I'm sure that there are many, many other issues that we can discuss. Hopefully we'll get to those during the break. Thank you.
Appreciate that.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, first of all, Chuck Hayes with the International Association of Chiefs of Police, and so I am also the governor's advisory committee chairman for the state of Oregon on DUII. So I'm kind of, we say DUII down there in Oregon. It's not stuttering, it's just the way we do that. But so I'm kind of wearing two hats as I come here today. But first of all, I have to say that I was at the original meeting that was in March in Washington, D.C. And my background with the Oregon State Police, and I spent 30 years there, retired as the director of our patrol operations with the Oregon State Police. And so impaired driving has been in my background since day one in law enforcement. I started out working for a city police department in Eastern Oregon, and the chief brought me in and told me I was arresting too many DUIs and to knock it off. And so I realized this was probably not going to be a good place for me. So I decided to go to work for the Oregon State Police. And so there, I could just arrest as many as I wanted. So it's been in my background for many, many years. I spent 31 years in law enforcement and 30 of that with the Oregon State Police. And so to go to this meeting, original meeting in Washington, D.C., and hear the deputy director talk about this and the people that came in, I was truly, truly excited about what we were doing and the huge steps that we were taking when it comes to drug driving, because this has been an issue for a long time. And so my position now with the International Association of Chiefs of Police is I'm the Western coordinator for the program. And so my area is going to shrink just a little bit because we've just hired a third person within the IACP, and so that person will take over the Midwest portion of the United States here very soon, and so it kind of shrinks my area down to NHTSA regions. Now it'll be actually 10, 9, and 8, and so over here on the west side of the country. And so I've had a lot of experience working with a lot of you in here in law enforcement. And so when we look at impaired driving, well, we got to kind of go back to the original and go back to the roots of this entire thing in law enforcement. And so we kind of look at it as a stepping stone or steps, so to speak, here. And so the standardized field sobriety testing, that program is something that we started many, many years ago. And I was actually involved in that original concept when we started doing that training and putting that curriculum together. And so that has been very much a part of my career as well. And so looking at the SFST program, and we all know about that, well, we're doing a great job not only in this part of the country, Region 10, but also throughout the country when it comes to training our officers now in standardized field sobriety testing. But what we do is we just kind of dip the toe basically in that program when it comes to talking about drug impaired driving. So as a result of that, we used to have this 8-hour program called Drugs That Impaired Driving, and so that was kind of our gap or a go-between, really between SFST and DRE, but we realized that we weren't doing enough there. And so what we did then, working with NHTSA, well, then we developed the A-RIDE program. And so I think just about everybody in this room knows what A-RIDE stands for, the Advanced Roadside Impaired Driving Enforcement Program, which is a 16-hour curriculum. And so that kind of took the place of the 8-hour Drugs That Impaired Driving. And so since we started that program, we've made some great gains, and I can tell you that in this part of the country, especially Washington, Oregon, and out here in the West, we're doing a great job when it comes to training people in A-RIDE and getting officers trained. And then the ultimate step, that top tier, so to speak, is DRE. And so first of all, we know that not every police officer in the country, not every police officer in the state of Washington or Oregon is going to be a DRE, nor do we want everyone to be a DRE, because we're looking for those truly motivated police officers that have shown that they have this propensity and they're good at arresting people for driving under the influence. They're the ones that are going to become our DREs. And so as we try to train officers, well, really the best place that we're getting our DRE candidates right now are coming out of A-RIDE training throughout the country. And so there are a number of states now that have made it as a prerequisite to go to DRE that you must go through A-RIDE. And so that is working out quite well. And we're finding out now as we do that, we're getting people, number one, that they're motivated because they went to A-RIDE and said, hey, this is pretty cool stuff. And so I really learned a lot. And gosh, the first thing they tell us is, oh my gosh, I've let a lot of impaired drivers go that were drug impaired after going through this training and realized what it was that I missed and the things that I was not doing and the things I was not looking for. And so that is showing us that A-RIDE works. And so working with that and then using that as a stepping stone for DRE is very helpful. So when we look at A-RIDE and what's going on around the country, well, it's taught by DRE instructors. And we do that for a purpose, again, because it kind of helps the DRE instructors, again, relate some of that information from DRE school, and are also seeing some of these officers that may make really good candidates for DRE later on. So in 2017, that was a banner year for doing A-rides. As you can see around the country, we did over 940 A-ride classes throughout the United States. We trained over 16,000 police officers. And since the inception of the program in 2009, we're over 50,000 officers that have been trained. And then not only officers, but also prosecutors are coming into that training, and then also toxicologists as well. And so it really does have applicability to those other groups and those other organizations. And so we encourage that. Washington State's doing a really good job as far as A-ride training, and so I get the classes sent to me all the time that we maintain on a national calendar, and so it's great to see those classes that are coming open, and we're making more availability for those officers to go to. On DRE, when we look at the drug recognition experts and then how we're doing as far as training those, well, we're getting close to 9,000 nationwide now. And so as you can see, in March of 2018, we had over 8,700 plus there throughout the United States. And so it was a banner year for us really in 2017 because we had 95 DRE schools that took place in the country. And so thus far in 2018, we're right at 92 classes, and we know that there's going to be some more schools that are going to be doing some training, more states that are going to be doing some more training later on in the year. And it's becoming an international program. So we're all reading about and hearing about the legalization in Canada. And so you can't help but look at any kind of publication or media release about impaired driving or the legalization in Canada without seeing something in there about DRE and the need for more DREs up there. And so this is the area, that third bullet, where we're really trying to improve upon, because we've got over 28,000 law enforcement agencies in the United States that have DREs. But we know that there's a lot more agencies out there that need and want DREs, but maybe due to their size and some of those things that they're having a difficult time doing that. And so I look at a model out of California. In California, the CHP, they're doing it right, because what they are doing is through the legalization of their marijuana, they're getting education funds to train law enforcement. But part of that funding is also going to supplement a law enforcement agency to pay them for an officer to take that officer's place if he or she goes to DRE school. And so if that agency's from a small department and said, I just would really like to send somebody, but I can't because I can't afford to have that officer gone for 2 weeks, well, then there's funding available to help with that. And there's interagency agreements to help get those officers replaced while that officer is going through DRE school. So that's a great thing, something that we maybe should put on our list as we look forward as to some of the more legalization efforts that take place around the country. DRE evaluations, and so I'm talking enforcement evaluations here. As you can see through the years, we've made some great strides. And so this is information that comes into the NHTSA National Tracking System. And so I would love to tell you that this is 100% accurate, but I cannot do that, because we know that about 65, maybe just a little less than 70% of our DREs are actually entering their evaluations into this national tracking system. So when you think about 65% of our DREs, and then last year we got over 30,000, close to 31,000 enforcement evaluations, that shows you that we're getting a lot of evaluations that are being done by those DREs that are reporting those evaluations and putting them into the system. And then, gosh, just think about the ones that we're not getting because the DREs maybe are not using that system like they should. So here's our kind of, when I put together the list of the top states, and so as you will see, my state of Oregon, I'm very proud of the fact that we're number 4, and Oregon has been in the top 5 for the last 5 or 6 years. And so when you look at enforcement evaluations being done by states, again, that are reported, you can see that California is right up there at the top of the list, but they've got the majority of the DREs, as we know. But the state on there that I really want to bring your attention to is the state of New York, because New York they have definitely doubled their evaluations in the last 2 years. And so why is that? And so we kind of take a look at that, and one thing that just continues to jump out at us about that is the fact that New York now puts in a tablet, an electronic tablet, in the hands of every DRE in the state of New York. And so not only is that DRE doing their evaluation using that electronic tablet, it's no more writing on a piece of paper with a pencil or a pen, but they're doing the evaluation, and then when they complete the evaluation, they hit enter, and it goes into their tracking system, which eventually then makes its way to the national tracking system. So because of that, we are seeing tremendous increases in New York. And so New Jersey, doing the same thing. They're also trying out some tablets as well. And so some of these other states as well. So we'll talk real quickly about that before I'm done. So if we look at Region 10, and it's a Region 10 here, this is not to embarrass anybody, but again, it's just to kind of give you an idea of what we're seeing as far as the states in this region. And so Alaska, again, they're kind of fluctuating just a little bit there. And so they haven't had a DRE school for a long time because of funding and maybe interest. And so they're going to be holding a school next month. And so maybe we'll see some increases there. But I love to see what's happening in some of the other states as well and some of those increases. Now, Washington, we know that at one time, Washington was right there in the top 5. You guys were there for a long, long time. But as a result, and some things have obviously happened, and so it's a case whether it's maybe the DREs are not being called, maybe it's this 5 nanograms per se thing, I don't know. But it's some things that we need to kind of take a look at and see what we can do maybe to help you out so that we can get those numbers back up there where they were at one time. And so we'll kind of finish talking about that. So what's working when I look at it from the national perspective and a Western coordinator and looking at it especially for these NHTSA regions over here in the West? Okay, number one, we got strong, really strong support. And so by strong support, not only do we have to have that from all of the different agencies and different organizations, so whether it's prosecution, toxicology, whether it's public health, all of those other kind of things, the Highway Safety Office, but we've also got to have strong coordination through the state coordinator as well. And that state coordinator is an integral part in making sure that the program is very successful because they got a tough job because they're out there dealing with a lot of different law enforcement agencies and trying to recruit these DREs and get those DREs working. So that team concept and working on that team's concept is truly something that's very important. So in Oregon, we just developed our latest strategic plan on impaired driving. And so if you look at our strategic plan, we are making sure that we got a lot of information in there about DRE and the DEC program. And then data, collecting data, reporting that data. You've already heard that talked about today. And then requiring that that data be entered by those DREs. And so some states have taken the approach, it's like if you're a DRE and you're not putting your data into this national tracking system, when it comes time to recertify you, okay, we're not going to do that. And then a DRE call-out system. So do I really have 0 time already? Okay, well, that really went quick. Okay, so a DRE call-out system, did you? All right, so the tablets I don't need to talk about, but what we can do better, maybe what's not working, is that we have got to get that information down to those frontline supervisors in law enforcement. So it doesn't do us any good to have a colonel or a chief or a sheriff that is promoting DRE within his or her agencies, but yet the supervisors on the street are not actually getting those DREs and allowing their DREs to do these evaluations. So we got to figure out a way to make that better. And then if we got non-productive DREs, we don't want you in the program. So it's more quality than it is quantity. So that's what we're looking at, is to get those DREs and get them working. And then the data collection, and then again, try not to overemphasize the ARIDE because ARIDE does not replace DRE. We still need DREs involved in these investigations. I kind of look at it as a crash reconstructionist. So when we have a serious crash, what do? We normally call out a crash team or a crash reconstructionist. So the same thing would apply for DRE. And then looking at things like a call-out system. So we have a call-out system here in Oregon, down in Oregon, and it works great. So 2 pages came across my phone last night looking for DREs in the area that I work in. And so those DREs are responding. And then the per se thing. I think that that's something that we've got to take a good look at. You heard Darren say earlier today that Oregon, we bypassed that bullet when we legalized marijuana there. Now, whether we'll be able to do that in the future, I don't know. But one of the things that it seems to do is that if there's a 5 nanogram per se blood level for THC, officers are just collecting the blood and hoping like heck that it comes back with 5 nanograms or more. And we don't want that. We still need a DRE. So as we look forward, kind of moving forward, the laboratory, you've heard that mentioned, and I cannot echo that enough, is the fact that we have delays in the laboratory that we need to fix. So in my state of Oregon, right now it's taking 8 to 12 months to get the toxicology reports back. And so what's happening there is the defense are raising motions that it cannot do a timely trial because they don't have the evidence. And so therefore, we're losing a lot of those drug-impaired driving cases. And so I also heard about the Buy America Act. That's something that I hope we can get resolved as well, because we have money in Oregon to buy a new instrument, but we cannot do it because it's not manufactured in the United States. And so some of these other things about the call-out program, and then exploring ways to effectively use DREs in other transportation or traffic safety areas. So whether it's commercial vehicles or some of these other things, we can do that with DREs, and we should be looking at ways to explore and to use those people, use those officers in those areas. So I went past my time, I'm very sorry, but that's what I needed to get through that. Thank you.
Thank you, Chuck.
I'm going to sit down. I have a few slides, but see, I have no idea where it's at.
Thanks. Escape.
Thank you. I'm going to sit down and do this. I can just kind of move the slides from here, but is that on? There we are. So one of the things that I appreciate everything that Chuck said there, and he brought up. One of the areas that we are having an issue in the state of Washington right now is with the DREs. Getting evaluations in, getting them done. There are some reasons behind that. We're having conversations. Chuck and I have had conversations I've had with Director Grondell, the impaired driving section. One thing with that, though, I'd like to bring up is that I'm quite proud of the Washington State Patrol, as every officer that's out for more than 1 year is A-RIDE trained. So they all have training. So we have 672 line officers. We are still down 50. Over the last few years, we've been down up to 137 field officers at any given time. So it's been a struggle for all law enforcement across the nation, maintaining staffing levels. But it was something that we took when I was a commander up north. Lieutenant Sharp at the time pushed it through our entire district, and we made sure every single officer in the district was trained, and then we pushed that around the state. So every officer inside the Washington State Patrol is A-RIDE trained. We don't train them in the academy because we want to have a little bit of experience arresting DUIs, seeing what the real thing is like out there before you try and provide them those advanced skill set. So I just wanted to touch on that. That's something that we do need to continue to take a look at, because in our conversations with DRE, it's a very valuable tool. We need to have that. But at the same time, I'm quite proud of the men and women of the Washington State Patrol, because I get to sit on a highway safety committee with international partners. And when it comes to activity, the Washington State Patrol across the nation is one of the leaders in proactive activity that drives down, we know by the data, drives down fatalities and injury crashes. And we take great pride in that. So I'll move on to the slides, as I don't have that much time. The first one here talks about fatal crashes with impairment. It's something that you saw similar earlier. Got to move it back a little bit. The alcohol and drug, I should have brought my glasses in, getting to that age. Alcohol and drug, actually I will take those, thank you, sir. It's really bad when you're a law enforcement officer and you have to start carrying these because you can't see the driver's license anymore when you stop one. I don't work the road very often, but I do make traffic stops, and it's horrible. So, and I really hate looking through these things. Alcohol and drug impaired cases, you can see the black line and the red line there. The red line is alcohol impaired only. They're both slightly decreasing or holding, but what you can see through the drug positive, the blue line, and the marijuana over the last few years, significantly increasing, specifically since the year 2012, when, back in the areas of the legalization type stuff. So this trend line is the DUI drug arrests. You can see that the blue line there, DUI drugs on the left-hand side approximately in 2012. This is only for the Washington State Patrol. This isn't for the state of Washington. This is data that I pulled from our TARS time and activity report sheets. And so this is information that we had 1,600 DUI arrests during that time. Kind of the area from about 2013 through about 2016, though those numbers decreased, as I stated earlier, this is where I would say, law enforcement has had a hard time filling positions, whether there's numerous reasons, and I don't have enough time to go into all of those. We are getting closer and closer to our staffing levels. For the last 2-3 years, I was down at any given time 137 field ops. When you have 672 line troopers and you're down 137, it has a huge impact to what you're able to accomplish and what you're able to do, filling vacancies in specialty areas all across the board. But the men and women did continue to do a great job. We did see decreases, so that's not anything as it relates to the number of drug cases out there or number of DUI cases out there. It really primarily it deals with staffing levels for all law enforcement across the state of Washington, specifically in the Washington State Patrol. We've been able to make ground on that, and like I said, so really what I'd like to point out is if you look at 2012 to 2017, our staffing levels are still below that of 2012, and we're even at about 1,600 drug cases, and I expect those to continue to skyrocket and go up as you see that trend over the last couple of years. The scale on the right-hand side deals with the ratio of alcohol to drugs, and when you go back and look from 2012 to 2017, or farther, you have an 11-to-1 ratio of alcohol cases compared to that of drug cases. In 2017, we're down to about an 8-to-1 ratio. So the number of drug cases are going up significantly compared to what they used to be. There's no less number of DUI cases out there. That's not what I'm saying. What it is that the percentage of those individuals using drugs is going up significantly. And that's really relevant when I get to the next slide. The average DUI processing time, whether it's drugs or alcohol. The two there, the blue line you can see, DUI without blood draws is the blue, all the way back to 2009. And then you can see the red, the DUI with blood draw. Blood draws are becoming more and more important because of the drugs. Our officers have to be well trained, whether it's ARIDE trained or DRE trained. But you can see the significant impacts that when we have to do a blood draw, how much more time it takes. The number of officers, as I said, over the last few years actually went down on the streets across the nation. Specifically here in the state of Washington, I'm aware of many of our peers, but you can see the amount of time that is taken just over the last, we'll say 9 years. It's increased just in the same category by 25 minutes without the blood draw, and it's increased over an hour with a blood draw. It's become more and more timely, and there are many reasons, and like I said, that could be a whole discussion point in and of itself. We're trying to do things that speed that up to include the electronic DUI form, which Director Grondell's agency has provided, and my staff, Captain Tim Coley and his group are working with others to make that entire form electronic so that you don't have to fill in the same data numerous times. You will be able to auto-populate a driver's license, auto-populate the registration. It fills in all of it, whether it's the ticket, whether it's the booking form, the report itself. The things that you write 7 to 12 times over and over again is auto-populated. Continuing to work on different things to include a possible phlebotomy program coming up. There are a couple agencies already in the state of Washington that are doing that, and Lieutenant Sharp is working for us right now, and we hope before the end of the year that's going to be something that the Washington State Patrol does so that we can be a one-stop shop. Not only do we make the arrest, but we can run it all the way through the end. It's difficult with hospitals sometimes right now. They are charging large amounts. It's not something they like to do because it takes their staff away for court time. That in itself is a whole other issue. The amount of court time that it takes, not only processing in the DUIs, but when it comes to court, the amount of time that we spend there. Specifically the district we're in, not to be pointing one direction or another, but there are districts around. When I say a district, some districts have one county, this one. Other districts have many counties. It is much easier to prosecute a DUI in timely fashion type stuff, or working with the officer and their schedules compared to a very populated county like the King County. So there are many things that impact these things, and like I said, we could spend hours and hours, as Grondell and I, Director Grondell and I have done, but with that, I'll stop.
Thank you very much. We'll open it up to questions to our panel. Questions, anyone?
So I'm standing up because Bill told me I had to ask a question. So we've played around with the A-Ride in our area. So as a task force, we pushed to have everybody in our region 100% A-Ride trained. And then we went to GASHA conference in Kentucky, and we heard from Colorado State Patrol, who incorporated the A-Ride training into their academy and kind of the struggles that they had. So we're kind of debating what the best practice is. So I was wondering, partially from Chuck and partially from Assistant Chief Sass, what are the best practices and when do we roll A-Ride training into newer officers in order to get the better bang for our buck, to make sure they have the adequate experience processing regular DUIs before we start throwing a little more technical stuff at them and maybe a little more complicated stuff. So I'd be interested to hear maybe what other people are doing around the country and what the best practices in that area are.
Well, in Colorado, they have discontinued that training at A-Ride at the basic academy. And so the Colorado State Patrol really took a hard look at that. They actually started doing some comparisons and found out that they were getting more impaired driving arrests from the A-Ride trained officers that were a year or two outside of the academy. And so as you know from your academy days, you get a lot thrown at you and sometimes you forget half of it by the time you hit the street. And so our recommendation, working with NHTSA, is that it be an after academy, after probation. Once that officer gets out on the street, then they go through the A-Ride training. And there's the problem, is that sometimes they get out there and then it's hard to get the training back to them or get them to the training. So as you heard, the Washington State Patrol, I think we're up to 20 states now that the Highway Patrol or state patrols have done entire A-Ride training, and they're doing it outside of the academy after they get through the basic academy.
And I would agree. I mean, it is difficult when you're in the academy. I always joke, you know, that new officers have a hard time submitting evidence. Well, you get like 1 hour on how to submit evidence. Well, it's a critical thing, because if the chain of evidence is broken, you can't get into court, prosecutors are frustrated with you, different things. Look, my time before working in the patrol, I was in the crime lab. I was going to be a forensic scientist. I understood evidence and stuff like that. I still didn't know how to submit evidence. You know, you have to go back and read the manual. So throwing that stuff at an officer when they're in the academy is difficult, because they haven't experienced what a DUI is. They haven't seen those different signs and have that experience. You give them a year, 2 years. But I believe the training is very valuable, and spending that time later on is worth it.
If I could put you on the spot, Lieutenant Sharp, could you give us your perspective? Could we get a microphone for him, please? Thank you.
I think all along that's exactly what we've strived for, is what Chuck's saying was the model. That's where we reached out when the program first began. What should we do? And we looked to the national perspective to say what's best. And it's worked for Washington. We wait till that first year's gone by, give them that experience, officers gain that knowledge. You overwhelm them in the academy. Absolutely true. You don't remember anything until you practice it. So you get out there and practice it, making some mistakes and learn from those mistakes is really what I think is happening. So I did have another follow-up question, unrelated to this one, if I can hijack it and go a different direction. So more of a national perspective for Chuck and maybe NHTSA, with the Supreme Court decision in Massachusetts that said that officers cannot testify to impairment, they can only testify to their observations, as well as even juries, witnesses, lay witnesses can't testify to what they think is impairment. They can only testify to, or state what their observations were. Is this a national trend? Has it been argued and defeated in other states, or is it coming to Washington soon and making DREs even more relevant and important?
Actually, your TSRPs would be very helpful on this, but I can tell you that we looked at this in Oregon immediately after that decision came out of Massachusetts, and so we felt like that we were covered there. But yes, we could see that trend of states trying to do this. And so what it's done in Massachusetts, it's really made more of an emphasis and a need to get more DREs trained. And so now you're seeing more DRE schools in Massachusetts, just so that they can maybe be able to attack this, because of the fact that, okay, just a normally trained officer, maybe an A-Ride trained officer may not be able to come in and testify to that. And so really the importance of DRE in Massachusetts, I think, is kind of skyrocketed as a result of that. But at this point, knock on wood, we haven't seen any other states that are following that.
Could we give him the microphone so we could capture that,
Yeah,
please?
so the people in the back, Lieutenant.
Thank you, Bill.
So it's one thing to train, it's another to utilize. So as Massachusetts put into practice a requirement, because it's almost impossible to evaluate every drug impaired driver with the DRE. So you're going to miss out to some degree. Even when we were in our heyday, we were hitting about 40% of our DUI drug arrests. So how do you compensate for the rest, especially if you have court
Well,
rules?
one of the things the DREs do around the country is that they come in and maybe do a DRE follow-up where they actually come in and testify. And maybe they weren't there for the evaluation, but they look at the evidence that was presented in the case, and so they could come in and maybe come in about the effects of the drugs in the drug category, and so that they can come in and use their expertise in that way. And so that has already happened in Massachusetts. We've done it in Oregon a few times, and so and what you're saying, Lieutenant, is definitely we sometimes don't always have a DRE there, but maybe the prosecution feels like, okay, we need to bring that DRE in so that they can lay the groundwork and maybe testify about some of those observation indicators to help make the case. Is that a fair assessment?
No, I agree. I mean, I guess I wanted to put an exclamation point on one of the aspects of that Massachusetts versus Gerhardt case, and it was that the court did not believe that the scientific evidence supported the conclusion that this person was impaired. I see a certain amount of drug in the body. Now I want to see some number that's associated with impairment so that I can believe you. And it wasn't enough for that judge for them to say, I saw X and Y and Z. Now, whether it was just that particular performance, that particular delivery, or is it a bigger problem? My concern is it is a bigger problem, particularly in the area of marijuana, which is what Gerhardt was about. Is that we saw a heartbreaking case last week in the area of meth, but judges and juries have the same problem, which is we don't have good evidence on the science side that we can give to Dr. Peterson and the forensic scientists to be able to say, this is absolutely impairment. There are too many steps between the event, whether it's a crash or just a pullover, and that conviction. We're having to extrapolate too many things, and one of the areas that I'm most concerned about is marijuana. I mean, the reality is that many of the scientific studies that we rely upon were done 30, 40, 50 years ago. And what was the two concentrations of marijuana that they looked at? The low dose was 1 to 2%, and the high dose was 3 to 4%. I toured a grow operation last week where their target was 28% THC concentration. This is like the difference between caffeine and cocaine. You can't compare those studies to what we're seeing currently with marijuana. But the studies that the toxicologists have to rely upon are the ones that are on the books. So, I mean, that's a whole area that is going to take a significant amount of investment. I know NHTSA funded studies, and now it's possible those studies need to be redone. And of course, there's that whole area of how do we support law enforcement with the investigation process? Because, frankly, we're using investigative techniques in most cases, like Gerhardt, that were designed for alcohol. And that was something that the judge throughout said, I'm not seeing anything that says that an alcohol-based SFST is going to work for the detection of marijuana impairment. So I'm not buying that. And that's heartbreaking because I get it. The judge was not insane. It's just not the conclusion that I think was supported in a DRE evaluation that we didn't have. So a lot of room for improvement both on the science side and on the persuasion side. But we're missing some critical tools, I think, there.
Any other questions?
We have a question right here to the left, Shelley.
I'm interested in, maybe any of you can answer this, but what are we doing as far as expanding the use of technology? You talked about Mr. Grondel's electronic form. What about, are you using electronic search warrants? Are you considering Polycom testimony in the courtroom so DREs are not removed from the street so that the toxicologist can continue to do testing and not leave the lab, creating further delays. And of course, I mean, I would echo all the sentiments on training from arrest to verdict, how important it is to have prosecutors and officers trained for the judges. But when we go to balance constitutional protections against data-driven fact-finding decisions in Fourth Amendment issues and speedy trial issues, technology could play a really huge role in helping you move this all along and give us what we need. So I guess I'm wondering, what do you have going?
I would agree with you, Judge, because this is something that we need to be exploring more of, and not just look at it state by state, but you mentioned one is the electronic search warrants, and so with responsibility.org and some other organizations, that is something that we're really promoting on the DRE side of things. But the thing that we have to really be careful about with the electronic search warrants is that when you get a state that has a 5 nanogram per se level, and so the officer makes the arrest and then gets that blood, and then they're just going to hope like heck that it comes back with 5 nanograms and makes their case, well then, and not doing a full investigation. So we want to make sure that there's no shortcuts that are there, because you can have all of the technology you want with oral testing devices at roadside, but somebody's still got to say, and somebody's still got to document that that person's impaired, as you know. And so we cannot just go with per se levels for as far as impairment without having a DRE involved. And so we think that the technology, whether it be phlebotomy, whether it be search warrants, whether it be oral testing devices, you combine that with DRE, and that's going to give you your best bang for the buck. And that's what we need to be looking at.
To some of the other pieces of your question, yes, some of that is being done, but I would say, Your Honor, welcome to Washington. Please feel free to stay, because everything you said is fantastic. We have 39 different counties. We have 39 different ways that they handle things in court. Some of the courts are very good about, we have Spokane County, Skagit County, a couple of the courts where their judges will, we can do that, the search warrant, and they are very quick, 10 to 15 minutes and done. We have other districts that we have a difficult time even getting a search warrant, let alone banging on their doors to see if they'll, answer type stuff. So yeah, it is different across the state, 39 different counties. The other piece that, the form you were talking about, I know that, or I'm sorry, let's go to the testifying piece. No, we have to, I'm unaware of any county, and you aren't either. So toxicology and the officers all have to appear in court. And like I said, there are certain counties that you will sit there all day long. I know that they have to travel across the state and sit, and it is frustrating. It goes back for many years. That we will, instead of just, it's time for you to testify, and let's put you on, whatever electronic, form you're going to use, and then have them testify. That would be great, because cities and counties a lot of times struggle to spend a lot of time. That's where I have a lot of our peers in the state of Washington. I'm very appreciative how much time they will spend in traffic, but for them, a lot of times, if they have 2 or 3 officers out, they're not going to tie themselves up with a 4 or 5 hour DUI. That's a huge portion of their budget, and then they've got jail costs, and like I said, there's so many ways that we could go into this, and so they're not as interested in doing that. There are discussions that, about that. So anything to shorten the process, putting an officer back on the street, putting forensic scientists back in the lab so that they can work on whether it's this or other cases would be great. And I would. Yeah.
Juries are used to this now, and judges are used to teleconferencing. Any reason that officers couldn't be trained to engage people with teleconferencing or toxicologists or?
Yeah. I don't see any issues with it.
Yeah, it's not a training
Okay, well, I can maybe help with that. That's probably my job then.
It's the ability for the court system, willingness to take that and accept that. In today's world with populations and stuff like that, it's not, you can't throw money at it. You just can't always throw more officers at it. Officers are very expensive. And so maximizing time, is what you're saying, to me is something that we have to move forward in the courts. I mean, I know there's cases where, that you need that officer there to really explain something in depth, but, I believe that a lot of the cases that we would have, if if you could keep the officers on the streets, it goes back to, it becomes a numbers game. You know, today's time, the reason I show the data that it takes, how much time it takes to process, I go back in time many years ago when, you know, Director Grondell, who used to be a member of the Washington State Patrol, or Brian Orsino, who former chief, and we, during our days many years ago, if you didn't have, you know, multiple arrests in a single evening time, you know, you weren't doing your job. But it takes an officer today 2 to 3 times longer just to process it. And then the court time, you know, that's going to take another day out of the middle of your week somewhere. So.
Yeah, we do. I think we do have, I appreciate the comment because it's not really an area I think we delve into, but in terms of the entire process, a big chunk of it is the preliminary process. You're not really talking about trial. You're talking about a lot of legal events before you ever get to trial. And a lot of those dispose of the case. They could be a motion hearing, they could be a probable cause hearing. There's no current prohibition that says legally in Washington we can't use some sort of a face-type Skype arrangement for any of that, because they're all legal determinations by the judge. It's discretionary with the court. And so it's an uphill battle, both for the prosecutors and for the court, because the reality is, the prosecutor, I don't have control of you when you're sitting someplace else. And if I make that phone call and you don't answer, that hearing may go away. If we're talking trial, that's a real uphill battle, because even though there was an opinion last week that talked about it being discretionary at the court, most judges, I think, just without even thinking about it, would say, no, confrontation clause violation. But there might be special circumstances where we could show that it would be, in this case, an important and justice-serving necessity, where we might be able to persuade a court. But setting up that in every case for that possibility, that's a massive investment of time and training. So I think we need to focus, at least for now, on the legal portion, where we could bring in a toxicologist to establish things like foundation for admissibility, or an officer for probable cause when we're talking about moving the officer a long distance, or even impossible distances like they're out of state, out of country.
John?
Moses, Shelley Baldwin, Washington Traffic Safety Mission. Moses alluded to a methamphetamine case that was, I think, had a tragic result. It's been on my mind since then. And it was a driver who had 2 milligrams of methamphetamine in his system. He was driving on I-5, slammed into the back of a van that was carrying children, killed 2 cousins of 2 girls, a 2-year-old and a 10-year-old, hurt the other boys that were also in the van. And they went to a bench trial, and the judge said that they couldn't find impairment, even though we had the methamphetamine result. So I don't want to, I don't know, other than what we heard in the news, anything more about the case. I don't really want to dwell on the case. But what I want to ask each of you is, if you had, you know, the ability, what rule or tool or funding mechanism, or what would you want so that we could say that these cases are always going to have the best evidence possible moving forward into a trial, so that I'm not left feeling like, wow, this judge has just now said that everybody can drive on methamphetamine, and we're never going to find them guilty, because her standard was we have to have something like we have for alcohol, where we know that 2 nanograms of methamphetamine equals this amount of impairment. And I don't believe we'll ever have that. So what would you guys recommend as the best possible wave the magic wand kind of solutions?
For me, it's, I think it was already said, that I don't need to deal with all the what-ifs. With a 0 tolerance Schedule 1 concentration, all of those things go away. It's strict liability. You don't drive with a Schedule 1 drug in your body. I don't care if you smoked it yesterday, the day before yesterday, last month. You do not drive with a Schedule 1 in your body. I may not be able to show that impairment through an officer, or I may have the classic symptoms of it, but I still end up having to prove impairment with anything higher than a 0.0. So for me, the wish list would be that's the standard It's what Nevada had for many years, and now they've lost it. And I think we are all now facing the reality that anytime you don't have strict liability and that zero tolerance, then we're talking about having to prove impairment. And now it's subjective with the person who's listening.
My wish list includes that a DRE be assigned and part of every fatal crash investigation team. And so the DRE should at least either go to the scene or be consulted, because there are times when these crashes involve people that you're just talking about right there that may not be showing some real outward signs of impairment, but if a DRE is involved and has a chance to look at that driver and follow up with that investigation, the DRE may find some signs of impairment that another officer may not. I'll give you an example in Chattanooga, Tennessee, with that semi-driver that crashed and killed 5 people. There was not going to be a DRE involved in that case until that driver made an admission about the fact that he had been arrested for driving under the influence of drugs in another state. And so they called a DRE in, and DRE did the evaluation and determined that that driver was under the influence of multiple drugs, and he was convicted. So we need, in a perfect world for me, we would have a DRE assigned to every fatal crash and every fatal crash investigation team and be used.
I don't know that I have a specific something. I do agree with Moses that it would be much cleaner and easier. For me, I take that and I twist it just a little bit. It's like what we were talking about there. I like to think that we would get them before this bad situation ever happens. And Shelley and I, you and I have had many conversations. And, you know, I've spent 27 years specifically, mostly in traffic law enforcement. And you know, it's always sad when we have to, you know, see a small child or any individual die, and it bothers me. I've stayed in the field operations side of traffic, you know, in the Washington State Patrol almost my entire career, and so there are a lot of things that what we're discussing that I would like to see, you know, that we don't have to take as much time, or that we don't have to spend as much time doing the really tiny things because of mistakes made, maybe in some other state, some other place across the nation. I believe many of the men and women in this state and in many states do it right, and unfortunately, you know, we spend so much time looking at the mistakes of a few that impact so much time of the many, and we're unable to do as much as we should be able to do. We can remove many more impaired drivers, whether it's drugs or alcohol, but we spend an enormous amount of time protecting against those little things, and so that's, for me, I just wish we could do that.
That's all the time we have for this session, panelists. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective and your expertise. We're going to...
All right. Everybody back, refreshed, energy, blood's flowing again. Got some good questions to ask our next panel? Good. So we are going to have Brianna Peterson come up and speak first, I think is the way that our calendar has it laid out. And are you doctor?
Sure.
Okay. Yes. Doctor. Dr. Brianna Peterson, and then following her, we'll have Julie Mitchell come up from Lakeside Mile and Recovery Center. So the one thing I just wanted to say is, you know, we put a lot of emphasis on the pre-arrest, the arrest, the post-arrest, and some of those elements. And so when we talk about the system and how we can help impact and the issues that they're faced with, is the lab has some significant challenges, and then getting back for prosecution. But then the other element that we see as kind of a glaring omission through, I think, a lot of our process is the treatment. And being able to address those elements, because we can arrest them, but that doesn't fix them. It doesn't keep them from repeating the crime again. And so I think that'll be a significant element about how we bring that together. And even as we were talking earlier, is how Deputy Administrator King, hope to be soon Administrator King, can work with her counterparts at the National Department of Health and some of those, and looking at what are some of those ways of combining resources around treatment, around traffic safety, around injury prevention, all those different elements, that it's not just NHTSA working on this, but it's a collaboration of federal agencies that may have grants and other things that we could look at to help support those types of programs. So with that, Dr. Peterson.
Hello.
So as Dr. Hoff mentioned earlier, in Washington State, we are kind of lucky in that we have this one centralized lab system, and we do not only just the DUI testing, but all of the postmortem drug toxicology, and then we also have a few drug-facilitated sexual assaults or drug investigations thrown in there. The other aspect that I think is really a benefit for the state of Washington is that our agencies don't have to pay for our services, and currently we are kind of funded to a point where we can do all the services that we want to do. So we can do alcohol and drug testing on all of our cases. We think that that's really important, and we can kind of prioritize that right now. So there are some states where it's a fee for service. So I'll just throw out Colorado, where you can pay $30 and get your alcohol result, but you have to pay a couple $100s to get your drug results. So finding out the true prevalence of drugs in that state is never going to occur if these agencies can't afford to pay it, or they're just going to be happy at staying with their 0.10 alcohol that they found. There's probably a lot of drugs on board, but we'll just never know. So it is a really good benefit for Washington and the data that we're able to provide nationwide. So our big story is just our case submissions and how they've increased over time. So you can see starting in 2013, we've had this sharp increase in cases, usually 10 to 15% increase every year. It's just been going up and up. We do see that it looks like it maybe is leveling out for 2018. That's just our first quarter data. However, if we kind of break down and look at our different case types that we get, we can see that our DUI cases is where our increase in caseload is coming. So the same amount of people are dying every year, but where our increase of caseload is all just our DUI, DRE cases. This year we're actually seeing a decrease in our death investigation cases. So we don't think that there's fewer people dying, especially since Washington's population is really increasing. It's just that our customers aren't submitting the cases to us because we're not able to get them the results in the time that they need. So they're making some tough choices about, well, I think this is a natural death, so I'm not going to send in the tox results because it's going to take too long, and I want to be able to sign out this death certificate. Or they're choosing to outsource and not utilize our services and just pay by themselves to send them to a private lab to get the answers that they need. So it makes it look like we're going to be okay with our caseload, but really we know we're not achieving the service that we want to all of our customers. And so with this increased caseload, unfortunately, we did not get increased staff or funding. So we've been operating at the same level for the past 5 years, even with our 45% increase in caseload. And so finally, last year, we kind of hit the wall where we couldn't become any more efficient ourselves. We've tried to change our testing practices and operationally make some changes, but we really just can't do the same product as far as a turnaround time. So for years, we were pretty good. It was maybe 18 days, 20 days was our median turnaround time. But this is just, as you can see, the slide shows, it's just steadily increasing and increasing this past year. Right now, we're probably sitting on like 3 months before we actually start to test a case. So this is still good maybe compared to some other states, but for our customers, they're not used to that. So they're used to having their tox report and they can go to trial whenever speedy trial is happening. But now we've had to try to message, that's not going to happen. Like, you're going to go to trial and you're not going to have our results. So you need to figure out that you have to dismiss and then refile later. So we're just having to change all of our customers' expectations. And so beyond court, it's also not good for those death investigations as far as people getting insurance money when their loved ones pass away, or just having the closure of a death certificate to do everything you need to do when that situation happens. So beyond our staggering caseload that I won't talk about anymore, I also want to talk a little bit about what drugs we're seeing. So this is for all of our case types in 2017. So alcohol is always going to be our most prevalent drug. About half of our cases have it. Next up would be carboxy-THC, which is a metabolite or breakdown product of marijuana. So it stays in your body a little bit longer, which is why we're probably seeing it in a higher prevalence compared to THC, which is the active component of marijuana. And then in Washington, the major drug for us is also methamphetamine. And then beyond that, we have morphine, which you can see from heroin use or prescription morphine, and then alprazolam, which is Xanax. So we have like some big hitters that we see all the time, and then a lot of the other drugs like over-the-counter and a lot of the prescription medications, we see a lot of them, but they all are like less than 5% of our casework. So usually we're just seeing meth, marijuana, alcohol, heroin. And so I looked at, for the past 5 years, which of our drugs are the most prevalent? Are we seeing increases in any of them? And so you can see that THC has been increasing, and this is all case types, so death and DUI cases. Cocaine hasn't really changed that much. I mean, it's increasing, but it's still not a large part of our casework. Methamphetamine continues to grow, and then morphine and alprazolam are slightly increasing. And so the questions we always get asked since we did legalize marijuana is how's that affected our DUI cases? So this slide just sort of shows that pre-legalization, we were pretty steady that about 18% of the suspected driving impairment cases that we received, we did find THC, which is the active part of marijuana. And then once that initiative passed and it was legalized, we've just seen an increase in the number of our DUI cases that have THC present. So we're currently, I think, at like 36% of our cases, or 34% of them have active THC. And then carboxy, which is just also an indicator of marijuana use, but maybe not necessarily that they used it that day. We don't really know, is always at a higher percentage, and that also was pretty steady pre-legalization, and now we're seeing it at a much greater rate in our DUI cases. And we've always been doing the same testing, so we've always been screening all of our cases since 2012 for drugs, so it's not that we changed our testing practices or changed our limit of detection. These last 5 years, it's all been the same thing that we've been doing. It's just that more of these cases now have marijuana detected in them. The other big question is about the opioid epidemic. I feel like in Washington, it hasn't really hit us full force like the East Coast. Yes, we do have a lot of heroin users here. We do see fentanyl, but just not to the extreme that you're hearing about on the East Coast or Florida. So we are seeing an increase in morphine, which is probably from heroin use. We are seeing more cases that have that. We are seeing a slight increase in fentanyl that is being used, but I wouldn't say that we have the problem that some states do. We usually are a little bit lagging as far as drug trends. It takes time for things to get over to the West Coast. So yes, it is an issue, but I think really methamphetamine and marijuana are things that are more on our mind as far as our drivers. And so I kind of presented some problems and what's happening with them. We were fortunate that last year we did get funding for 6 full-time employees until the end of this biennium. And so we have been able to hire 4 new scientists, a supervisor, and then like a property and evidence custodian that helps with the intake of all of these cases. The funding is temporary though, and we do have to train new scientists. It usually takes us 9 months before someone can start doing casework. So our funding will run out in a year. But we're hopeful that we may ask that these positions be made permanent. We think it's something that we need long term. They were given to us to help reduce our backlog, but we're kind of cognizant that it's not just the backlog, it's just that our caseloads increase. So even if we get rid of these 3,500 cases that are sitting there waiting to be worked on, long term, the cases are going to keep coming in, and we do need additional staff. So that's all I really had as far as our major needs or the status of the tox lab right now.
I'm Julie Mitchell. I am Senior Vice President of Operations at Lakeside Milam Recovery Centers. I also represent the Association of Addiction Programs for the state of Washington. And I want to thank Darren and Traffic Safety for always including me in these events. And we're often overlooked when it comes to impaired driving and solutions for that. So I'm grateful to be a part of this and grateful that you always include us. We are healthcare, but we are very interested in public safety. And what we do really intersects with public safety in the area of criminal justice. I've said this before, and it's not always a popular comment, but there are many, many victims when we look at impaired driving and crashes. We have the victims that have been injured or the deaths, the fatalities. We also have victims behind the wheel, and those are the victims of the disease of addiction. I came into the field in the late 70s, so I've been doing this for almost 40 years, and my passion for this is very, very personal. I have lost a brother to a drinking driver, lost a father to the disease of alcoholism, and I have a younger brother who is in recovery for 20-plus years. So I have a very personal and professional mission in this area in helping the many, many victims that we see. I was fortunate enough to come into the field when there were we were really in our infancy as far as treatment goes in the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s. And the one thing that was taking place at that time was the law deferred prosecution was written and passed in 1975. We still have that law in the books 40 plus years later. It's changed quite a bit, but it was very insightful by the pioneers in our field that, hey, if we treat the people that have the disease of addiction that are breaking the law and they don't drink or use drugs anymore, they're not going to break the law anymore. So it did and continues to decrease recidivism, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about how I think we can do a better job utilizing that law. And really, I see the goal is to decrease recidivism through early identification and intervention treatment for the alcoholic addict driver. What's currently working in the state is we have really good quality treatment. Washington State has been a leader in the area of treatment, addiction treatment. Some of the early pioneers included Dr. James Milam, who wrote the book Under the Influence. He was one of our co-founders, did a lot of the early studies on addiction as a brain disease and treating addiction as a brain disease. So we have good quality treatment. We have a large continuum of care in the state, from detox to residential to outpatient to recovery houses. So as far as treatment goes, we have a lot of good quality treatment. When someone is convicted of a DUI, we do an assessment and treatment, in theory, for those individuals. They're required to have an assessment and follow the treatment recommendations. That's very positive. Tying it to the conviction and tying assessment and treatment to the driver's license reinstatement is also something very positive that we're doing and that's working. We also have seen DUI courts popping up across the state, and that is very positive in terms of treating the individual that needs treatment, holding them accountable. I don't have to go into all the qualities of a DUI court, but it's great to see that happening on a larger scale and hope to see more of that. I think what's needed in terms of treatment is we really need a work group. We've talked about this before, of the stakeholders to take a look at early intervention, particularly with first-time DUI offenders. There have been some studies, none recent that I'm aware of, that would indicate 80% or better of first-time DUI offenders are in need of treatment for substance use disorder. We don't necessarily treat it that way with our laws, but we need to do a better job of that early intervention and treatment. And here's why. Early intervention, we're more successful. We get somebody on a first DUI, they still have a family generally, they still have a job, they still have insurance, they still have something in their life to hang on to. So treatment is oftentimes more successful with that type of individual. We see less progression of their disease of addiction and fewer progressed mental health issues as well. So we talk about the issue of co-occurring disorders and dual diagnosis treatment. The earlier we can treat somebody with a substance use disorder, the less we see the need for that. So treatment is much more effective. So I believe a work group to look at how to do that would be useful. Brief intervention. We use brief intervention in the hospitals in Washington State. The company that I work for and many other companies do this as well, where we go into the hospital's emergency rooms or psych wards or wherever the social worker will identify the individual might be there as a result of a drinking incident. We go in and do a brief intervention screening with them, and they're in crisis. They're often pretty willing to listen at that point, and it's been very successful getting that individual into care. And it's their choice at that point, using that crisis of being hospitalized as the intervention point. I would like to look at doing that in this state with someone who's arrested for a DUI and sent to jail. Have the availability of treatment professionals to go in and do a brief screening intervention at that point. They haven't been arraigned, nothing. It won't interfere with any of the legal aspect of what comes next, but they're very vulnerable at that point and scared and ready to do something. once they are arraigned and go see legal counsel, the fear is gone, right? So they're told everything's going to be okay. So we've missed that opportunity to help that individual. And if we can access that individual and help them at that point, again, treatment is going to be more successful. That's something I think is needed. I think increased access to deferred prosecution is needed, and I'll apologize to the prosecutors in the room. But in the late 1990s, there were several changes to the deferred prosecution law, and that's a law that really offers treatment in lieu of incarceration. And although it's not necessarily their choice, it feels like a choice for the people that we're treating. In the late 90s, we changed the timelines and the length of that program. Neither one of those changes has resulted in any statistics that would indicate a better outcome. So I would like to suggest we review the timelines on eligibility and review the length of the program. The early studies, and again, we haven't had any of these studies recently, but did indicate somebody in a light group that was convicted and referred into 2 years of treatment, or the deferred prosecution individual that entered a deferred and into 2 years of treatment. They're both substance use disorder people. The convicted ones had a recidivism rate of 48% at 4 years, where the deferred prosecution individuals had a recidivism rate of 22% at 4 years. Okay, so that's fairly significant, in my opinion, in terms of decreasing recidivism through deferred prosecution, through treatment, through deferred prosecution. And I think with the bright minds we have in this room, we can all come together and come up with some way to increase access to that. And we would need to also come up with solutions to eliminate financial barriers to deferred prosecution, because that also is a problem with deferred. As far as gaps, one of the biggest gaps that I currently see is lack of probation services. Probation is necessary to hold the DUI offender accountable, and their partnerships with us as providers. And with the decreased number of people at probation officers, we then have to kind of take on a dual role with these folks. We're reporting directly to the court clerk. So we become the treatment provider and the probation counselor. And that's a very difficult position for us to be in. It makes it much more difficult for us to develop that therapeutic relationship that is so necessary. So we miss our probation partners, because we'd be much more effective if they were helping us keep the offenders accountable. And we've seen a huge decrease there. Would like to see expansion. Another gap is the DUI court. There aren't as many as I'd like to see, and it is so extremely valuable for the multiple DUI offender. And necessary in our state, particularly because we're not identifying and treating them early on. We're getting them into treatment after the second, after the third, but not after the first. So DUI courts. And the third gap I've identified, and it kind of came to my mind today as we were discussing youth treatment. 10 years ago in the state of Washington, there were probably 7 or 8 residential treatment facilities for youth. We have 2 in the state of Washington today. Lakeside Milam Recovery Centers had a youth facility in Burien. It was 53 beds. It was full almost all the time. Then there were some changes, one of which was legalization of marijuana. Another one was decrease of funding to the schools for prevention intervention specialists. The very real concern on the part of school districts enforcing whatever our assessment and recommendation was in fear of litigation from parents. A variety of reasons lent itself to the fact that adolescents are not accessing residential care in our state, and very few are accessing outpatient care. And the end result of that is we've seen an increase in the number of people in their early 20s. And they're much further progressed in their disease, using a few more drugs than marijuana and alcohol, when in the past we were able to identify those that had the genetic predisposition, had the brain disease as a teenager, and help them get clean and sober at that point. So that is one of the other gaps that I see. Thank you.
Do we have any questions from the audience or our panelists?
Hi, I had a comment and a question for Julie. One of the things that we had funded the development of was at Harvard Medical School. They developed a computerized and standardized assessment and referral system, and it's one of the only tools that looks at alcohol and drug abuse and dependence within the last 12 months and year, and also an array of, I think, 20 mental health disorders. And then it, at the touch of a button, generates a report, and there's a self-screener, an administered screener, and then an administered assessment. So if that's anything that might be helpful to you, I'm happy to connect you with Harvard. The other thing I was going to ask, and I'm sure people in Washington know the answer to this question, but what happened to your probation? Because that is such an important part of the process, to monitor those offenders.
Do we have a probation? We do still have probation. Do we have a probation person here that would like to answer that? I can.
Grant was here, but I think he stepped out.
Decreased funding? Is that a fair answer to that question? Primarily?
I have a question for Dr. Peterson. So you mentioned this briefly, but with the laboratories, there's a lot of testing that is done by the laboratory, and so let's say a blood sample comes in and maybe it's a crash, and so the first test is done is for alcohol, and so if alcohol is detected, well then, as we know throughout the country, a lot of labs then are not doing any further testing. So they're not looking for other drugs other than alcohol. And so my question to you is that how do you handle those here in Washington? And is that something that we could model in other states and get other state laboratories to do that? Or do you think that it's a lost cause as we try to deal with this and try to identify other drugs when we do get a positive alcohol sample and a blood sample?
No, we think it's really important to still do the drug screen. So when the decision was made that operationally we want to move forward with this, we took, I think, 500 cases that had a 0.10 alcohol or higher, and we screened them for drugs, and we would have missed drugs in 36% of them. So that's a lot. And so in 2012, we started screening all of our cases for drugs, regardless of the alcohol concentration. And so I think it's really important, but I mean, I said we're funded enough now, but if we ever get to a point where our caseload keeps increasing and we don't have the budget to support it, that is a decision we'll have to make. Like maybe we can't screen for drugs in all of these cases. So we're in a good position. We want to keep doing it. We think it's really good for the statistics to know what the prevalence is of all these drugs, and you'll miss that if you're not looking for them. So yeah, I think it would be great if every state could do it, but just as we weren't before and we understand limitations, they might not have instrumentation or staff or just the money to be able to do it.
Brianna?
Yeah.
Could you share with the group how many drugs you actually screened for in your process?
So we probably in-house can find maybe like 150, 165 drugs that we're kind of routinely looking for. Maybe there's several hundred that we can kind of detect. We can't quantitate all of them and give a value, but in our standard testing, we're probably looking for like 150, 175 different, and then based on case circumstances, if we're given information about the impairment that was observed or drugs that were admitted to being taken, we can look for drugs outside of that, but it's a key point. As our state's moving to that EDUI, we think it'll help us because we're not always given a full police report. Like we might just get blood and it's just someone's name. And so we do our testing, and some of our tests can miss things. But if we know the specific drug, or if we know this person had 6-6-HGN, then we know what further testing to do to try and look for that. Because there's not just one test we can do that finds every drug. Like we kind of have to tailor it. So You know, the more information you get, then the better job you can do.
I just wanted to add to that too. When we did our analysis of our fatal crash drug driving data, we often get asked did it increase because the lab started doing full panel testing in 2012. And prior to that date, because our data goes back to 2008, we had 20 or 30 a year that only had alcohol-only tests. And then, of course, after 2012, that went down to less than 10 every year. However, those alcohol-onlys were typically BAC values from a breathalyzer from the officer, so a blood sample was never sent to the lab. So that's likely because most of our testing is on deceased drivers, and I'm sure you probably were doing fuller panels for the deceased prior to that time. So I wanted to mention that because when we do the fatal crash analysis, that's a much smaller limitation than it was with the broader data that you guys work with.
True, a good point. So all vehicular homicides got drug testing regardless of alcohol. So we had some caveats to the alcohol prior to 2012, and then all traffic fatalities, if someone does die, we always do a comprehensive drug test, not just the limited drug screen.
Quick question. You mentioned that you had, Dr. Peterson, 6 hopefully permanent staff additions on the forensic sciences side, or 5 plus 1. Now, I know that there were a lot of sacrifices in terms of efficiency to get to the point where you could handle as many blood cases as you could do. My question is whether or not that addition, even if it became permanent, would allow the forensic scientists to appear in cases that were not blood. Because as you know, historically, prosecutors have used toxicologists for a whole variety of support reasons in the courtroom to discuss alcohol, for example. And more that has fallen away.
So I guess I should mention we've also have some positions that are funded by the Traffic Safety Commission. So we have 2 scientists that are on grant positions for that, and we've received money from Department of Health. So even with these 6 legislative positions, we have other positions that aren't permanent, that are grant funded. So I hear what you're saying. Right now, I don't think I can see that far in the future of, you know, it takes a while for the cases to actually go to court. So like, yes, we're having this increase, but like our amount of time that's required in blood cases for court is increasing every year because we have all of these cases. So our court time has kind of leveled off in the last few years as we've stopped appearing for breath cases. But we anticipate our blood cases will continue to increase. So do I think we'll have the resources to go testify on refusals? Probably still not, no. Just the amount of time it takes to train people. So I think that would be a few years before we could really look into that. Sorry.
I always appreciate a mic because I don't have good hearing on this side. So one of the things that I really appreciate that Julie talked about was the not getting our youth into treatment. And that's a result of losing our safe and drug-free schools and communities dollars at the federal level. Our Senator Patty Murray was extremely huge advocate for that, but other states didn't use the money well. And so in our state, through the Department of Behavioral Health and Recovery, we have coalitions, and in Spokane we have 2 coalitions, and of those coalitions we have 2 student assistance specialists out of 15 high schools, because that's where the funding comes from. So you're right, that's why kids are not being referred, and we are not getting the youth into treatment that we have. And so as I'm listening to this, my question is about how can we advocate together for the state legislature as well as the national level, because we know the marijuana industry are pursuing candidates who are marijuana friendly and trying to move leadership across this nation to legalize marijuana. And that just leads to changes to initiatives and everything else that then the money doesn't go to. How can we come together where prevention can advocate for treatment, treatment can advocate for the lab can advocate for law enforcement? We're trying to do that at a grassroots level, but I really see we've got to do a work group or something to have our united voices ask for funding, because we should not have to worry about losing these labs. As a mom who watched our case get delayed and delayed and delayed while this man pleaded not guilty to killing 2 people and severely injuring one, is so frustrating that a system then goes back and re-traumatizes a family. And I think we have to come and have our voices heard at the state, at local, state, and national legislative levels. So how do we do that? How do we do that without breaking the rule about talking about lobbying? How can we become advocates and get our demands for real justice heard?
Thank you.
I don't have an answer. I agree with you, and I don't know for sure what the solution is, but I certainly think that the people in this room can come up with some solutions to that and work together toward that. We can do better.
Okay, I have just a quick question. Dr. Peterson, if carboxy is identified in a sample, is that carboxy coming from an active, something that's in the brain? So if it's in the blood and it's being sloughed off, is there something still active in the brain for it to be in the blood?
No. So it's like your body is converting it to something else just to eliminate it. So it's its own separate compound that has no psychoactive effects. So it does mean at one point you had THC, but it's been converted to carboxy THC. So they're two separate compounds, and one has effects and one does not. Does that help you?
Thank you.
Okay.
Yes.
Any other questions? How many members of the WIDAC committee do we have on board today? Over a year and a half ago, I presented talking about an impaired driving blueprint to the WIDAC group. And I talked about things such as law enforcement. We have these mature processes, toxicology that we're getting a handle on, the legislative impacts. How do we have a conversation with policy makers, the judicial outreach, public outreach. And I was really proud of my presentation. I was wrapping it up, and I think it was you that said, wait a minute, I have a question. You left out treatment. And I honestly did, and it was an honest mistake because I thought the treatment was within all the process that I had just described. If you break the law, we're going to get you, and we're going to put you through this criminal justice process, and at the end of that, you'd be a model citizen. And that's just not the case because we have too many cases of heartbreak out there, families losing loved ones to people that recidivate. And so my question is, how does treatment fit into this overall scheme? Because we've put so much time and effort and thought into the criminal justice and all the things that we've talked about today. How can we plug treatment into this to continue the story, if you will? How can we work more closely with that aspect of it? Because this is something that I haven't really thought about because I was so ingrained in the thought of how do we address it, the problem in the highways. I'm from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, so highways, how do we deal with that? But once we put them through the process, then what do we do with them? And I thought, and I was naive enough to think that that was somebody else's problem, but it's mine. It's my problem, it's our problem, it's everyone in this room's problem. I mean, how do we deal with this treatment aspect of it? Could you respond? Could you give me some insight?
Well, I think that continuing to look at some of the laws that we currently have on the books and increasing access to them, one being the deferred prosecution, it's somewhat unique to this state. I know other states have similar laws to that. But what it really does is it allows an individual to take a look at their use early on in the process and make a decision to get some help and to stipulate to facts and findings that if they don't make it through the program that they're automatically convicted of the charge. They testify in open court that they have a substance use disorder problem, which begins the process for them. There's a lot of problems with the deferred prosecution law currently, don't get me wrong. I think that it does allow people to have a bit of dignity and in their minds choose to go into treatment when we all know that it is a legal intervention for them. And that really promotes them doing well in the treatment process. So I think, at least for Washington State, that's a law that we could take a look at and increase access to. I know for us, we have 10 outpatient locations at Lakeside. We've been in business for 35 years, and 20 years ago in phase 3, which is basically the second year that someone's in treatment or being monitored by us, 20 years ago, we had 3,000 people probably in that program. Currently, we maybe have 300 people in phase 3 of a deferred prosecution. That's how dramatically the numbers have decreased in terms of people accessing treatment through that program. And I would suggest that even if, only 80% don't ever reoffend, because there are going to be some that reoffend, but 80% of 3,000 is a much better number than 80% of 300, right? So how can we increase access to a program that we know has worked? We have become somewhat complicated, our DUI laws, somewhat, that's probably an understatement, very complicated in the state, which has allowed for many loopholes or legal challenges to a lot of the good intentions of our laws and have resulted in some unintended consequences, which one is, I think, by deferred prosecution only being available once in a lifetime, many defense lawyers who are zealously representing their legal problems of their clients will recommend, don't use it now, wait till you have a second DUI. In my opinion, that increases, that just promotes recidivism. So that's an unintended consequence, if you will, of making it once in a lifetime. So I think there's some things, if we got together, that we could do to increase that early access to treatment through the legal intervention. And it's huge. People are in crisis when they get a DUI, and we want to take advantage of that crisis and intervene at that time.
Thank you. Thank you. This morning I was privileged to sit down and have a conversation at the Washington State Patrol's toxicology lab, and Dr. Cooper and Dr. Peterson. And we talked about things that are facing the toxicology aspect of this story that we're talking about, and some of the impacts and what the state is currently doing. And Dr. Peterson, what can others learn from the program that you described to us this morning? What story can we tell other states about what Washington is doing in light of the not only the legalization of marijuana, but of the increase of poly use that we're seeing out on our highways and our streets? What story can we tell the rest of the country?
I think two things come to mind. One is just any change that is made, you kind of have to think of the whole picture. So if you're going to start training your officers to do phlebotomy, then think about the downstream effect. Does that mean you'll have more blood draws and more cases that need to be worked? So marijuana legalization is something easy to look at, but I think there's lots of policy changes that can happen where you just have to think about the whole process and all the players involved and how it affects them. I think the second thing I think I've kind of heard mentioned a lot is just the more data you have, the better you can be. So like we don't really have a good way to link into a collision or traffic fatality. Like we don't have that information, but someone else does, and then they have to contact us to get the data. But if we can't get a methamphetamine to be proven that can cause impairment in court, and some of it was based on the studies or the literature that are out there, like we have a ton of data if we could link it into the whole story, right? And we could publish, but then that also leads to we're understaffed, so we have all this data, but we don't have the time to publish. So I think that there's a lot of like big pictures that could be put out there even for the court system. Like Moses was saying, like knowing what are the drug concentrations. So if all the different parts that are here today could kind of work together to create the bigger picture, it could benefit everyone in their individual role, I think.
Thank you. Thank you. Any other questions? I'm taking up all the time here, but I'm happy to do so. Julie, do you work with some unique partners to enhance your program effectiveness? And those are the ones that usually are not typical to ones that I work with, say law enforcement, judiciary, those types of things. Do you have some unique partnerships that you use to enhance your program delivery?
So in the field of treatment, we do work closely with the medical community. with primary care physicians, with mental health therapists, with psychiatrists, with marriage counselors. I mean, we would not be effective with our patients in long-term recovery if we didn't utilize all of the community, the recovery network, as we call it. We try to identify whenever someone comes to treatment with us what their recovery network looks like and how we can engage them with those individuals for services. Everybody comes to us with a unique set of additional problems, whether they're co-occurring diagnosis or not, is really can be determined after somebody's been clean and sober for a period of time. But if there truly is a mental health diagnosis that needs to be addressed, we do use community partners for that.
Okay, thank you. Questions? Again, I'm taking up all the time. I'd like to thank the panelists. Please give them a round of applause. Thank you very much for sharing your perspective with us. I'd like to open the floor up to any general questions that we have of maybe things that we've covered today and you didn't get the chance to ask, or if there's stuff that has kind of popped in your mind and what questions you may have as a result of bringing this kind of expertise together to have this kind of conversation. And I can't thank you enough, Deputy Administrator King, for coming here and shining a bright light on this subject with us and for us. This really helps bring things together and bring our thought process together. I can't thank you enough for coming all the way from DC to do that with us. The other Washington, yeah. So thank you. But are there any other questions that you may have that would add to the richness of the conversation that we're having today? Because we really want to capture this and really take this on a much broader scale.
Hey, Greg, I want to open up an area of conversation. So coming here is the easy part. The hard part is what's already been done and the years of work ahead of us. I wonder if folks have thoughts to share with us all for discussion on the gaps in the science of impairment specifically. Especially someone who's been up against defense attorneys on the difference between labs and impairment. I know you have stuff to say.
Hang on.
So again, Amy Friedheim, and I'm a senior deputy prosecuting attorney. I can't emphasize enough the importance of funding our lab appropriately. It is really very shocking that we have such a long turnaround time. I mean, I can't imagine a state with a 12-month turnaround time, but we're approaching that. And we see that because there's more reliance on blood tests, because we have more drug use, polydrug use, and the only way to document that drug use in impaired drivers is through the blood test. So the lab is getting backlogged, but the problem with it is that in some prosecutors' offices, they cannot charge the case until they have a lab back, because they are having cases dismissed after a speedy trial is set. They're having cases dismissed if the lab isn't back in time. So they can't even charge a case until a lab is back. And if you can't charge the case, you can't have conditions of release for a defendant. So a defendant cannot be achieving any kind of safety measures in the community. They are at large in the community. And for many of these people, you know, you're talking about a repeat DUI offender who might have killed or seriously injured somebody, who is out without any kind of court oversight or safety oversight because our lab is so backed up. And the other thing about our lab being backed up is that our analysts are not available to testify. And this is what comes down to the testifying, because the people hours, the hours that our lab analysts have to spend in testifying takes away from their analyzing, and it is significant. And I don't remember how many hours per month it is per analyst, but I'm sure Dr. Peterson has a number somewhere, but she's saying don't call on me because I can't remember what it is. But that takes away from their being able to analyze. It takes away from their being able to testify. They're available to testify, obviously, in vehicular homicides, vehicular assaults, if there was a blood test done. but they're not able to testify, as Moses pointed out, in all the vast other cases. So you might have somebody who did an alcohol test, a drag or a breath test for alcohol, but admitted to some other drug use, and the observations that the officers made are consistent with the drug use, but now you can't have an analyst testify and talk about observations that are consistent. And I don't know what happened in Snohomish County. I do not know the facts, the evidence in that case, or what the charges were, apart from vehicular homicide under what prong. But it is hard for me to imagine, after 18 years of just doing felony traffic cases, that if I had a lab analyst testifying about the effects of methamphetamine and observations of methamphetamine use that are consistent with that impairment, that testimony would not have credibility. That would be very important in a homicide case. And a DUI case, which means the officer stopped the person before they did kill somebody. So I don't mean to press everything on the lab, but properly funding our lab is paramount, because the backlash then in criminal safety and criminal justice is tremendous. We can't get, Lakeside Milam is a private agency, so a lot of the defendants who have enough resources might be able pre-trial to get involved in treatment. But we have a lot of people who do not have those kind of resources, and it is only the criminal justice system that tries to get them into some sort of treatment and evaluation. We don't have the money for treatment for people who don't have the resources. Insurance, as we all know, has plummeted. I suspect that is part of the reason why we don't have the beds filled, because insurance doesn't cover treatment the way it used to. So it is part of the whole issue, but really for criminal justice, the lab is so important because of their ability to get the results to the law enforcement as quickly as possible, and also their ability to testify across the board in cases where you see evidence that's consistent with drug impairment, where they may not have done actually the blood test. So that's my 2 cents as a prosecutor.
Thank you.
Deputy Director, one of the things that I think we really need to look at, and it was touched on just briefly today, was new research. And so I think about the DRE program, the DEC program. So we're still living on the Johns Hopkins study from 1983. We're living on the LAPD field study from in 86. And so Canada has actually done a couple of research on the DEC program, and as far as looking at validity of that program. So they've done some, but it's still pretty old as well. And so I know from prosecutors and TSRPs, if you were to ask them, that they think this is probably one of the things that we really do need to do. So I don't know what's in line or what's down the road for your research folks there at NHTSA, but not only to really look at the DRE program and the validity of that program, but also looking at some of the drug categories and maybe doing more research in that area. And then don't forget the standardized field sobriety testing as well, because all of our research from that was done by NHTSA back in the 70s and early 80s, I think Mr. Garcia touched on this, is that we get a drug DUI and the officers are using SFSTs and there's no research to back that up, that they actually apply for drugs other than alcohol.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chuck. I'm just thinking for our note takers, is there any clarification that we need from anything that has been covered today? Okay, all right. I was just curious if we need clarification on anything that was, okay. Any other comments, observations, questions?
I just have a question. One of the NHTSA databases that I've heard about lately is a DRE observation database. But like some of the other data systems, I've been told don't use it because it's not good data. So can you talk about the partnership between the ICAP and NHTSA around improving not only the collection but the quality of the DRE data that NHTSA is already in possession of?
Chuck, do you want to take that one? Bill, you can comment. You have the mic.
Yeah, I can comment. First of all, my name is Bill O'Leary. I've been quiet all day. But I'm the program manager for NHTSA for the Impaired Driving Enforcement Programs. I work very closely with law enforcement, prosecutors, and toxicologists. So I can tell you this has been great for me today. But to comment on the DRE database, it's not a scientific database in that the numbers that we have have gone through a scientific review. However, we currently are in the process of doing a test bed for a brand new data system that should be going live in August. And we've gotten everybody on board as far as the DRE state coordinators to hopefully increase the number of states that are going to be using the data. It's incorporated with the tablets that Chuck Hayes talked about. So the old data system, I use it, but I have to be very careful how I use it because it's not scientific. But it gives me a pretty good picture of what's going on around every state in the country. So when I go out and present, I'm careful how I use the data. But I can tell you, I can show you the opiate explosion in the Northeast, and I can talk about a new drug that's coming aboard here out west. It's a little too early for that, but it does have some use, and I'll finish it by saying there's a brand new database coming out in August.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you. Please.
So I feel one of the important things is to expand past just traffic safety or working together and talk about the economic impact of marijuana and safe driving or not safe driving. I'm also on the city council in Spokane Valley, and one of the issues that Waste Management told us is they can't find truck drivers to drive garbage trucks because it can't pass drug tests. And we're seeing that in a lot of businesses across the nation. And I think if we can start talking to businesses and economic development folks about how we don't have to keep traffic safety or impaired driving in a silo over here, that this is going to affect business, and that's going to affect the bottom line for our country. And as we're talking about insurance is not covering some of the treatment and things, that we've got to realize that I think it's 80% of folks who are drug affected are in jobs. They're working, and people, and of course we want them to be in recovery and want to support that, but we've got to start saying this is an economic issue that is going to affect our country even more as the opioid crisis and the marijuana legalization happens. And I think that's a way to get more partners on board to help us.
Thank you. Any other comments, observations, questions? Yes, right over here, please.
Thank you. A comment. We were having a discussion, some of us during the break, and I think that, we talked today about prevention, trying to teach kids when they're young, responsible use, and talking about parents and their role. We've talked about enforcement. We've talked about what happens after they're arrested. And I think that the bigger piece on this that is the harder thing to tackle is our culture of overuse of drugs, of alcohol, of marijuana, that, the acceptance of getting drunk, of getting high, getting obliterated. And I think part of this that we need to be thinking about is how do we change the culture, and especially when advertising is so predominant and people are, it's not the newspapers anymore, but it's your smartphones, it's social media, the YouTube videos of how fast can you chug a 24-ounce Four Loko or whatever. And I think that's going to be our bigger challenge, is how do we change the view of how substances are used so that we can put less money into enforcement and put less money into treatment, because we're getting more at the root of the problem.
Thank you. Thank you. Any other questions, observation, comments? Yeah, Moses, please.
Seemed appropriate to have a lawyer finish it off when he started.
Closing arguments, please.
Yes. Well, one comment is, I know we think about it, but one sort of bedrock foundational thing that I think I want to add to my tool chest in terms of thinking about problems is recognizing the difference between the solutions that we come up for urban areas and those that will work in rural areas. I know in Washington, we've got 30% of the miles driven in the rural areas, 50% of our deaths occur there. I know that many of the techniques that we come up with originate in the urban areas because that's who has the critical mass. They have the resources to be able to dedicate staff to solving the problem on a global level, and the little rural areas simply do not. But the technique that works so well in LA and migrates to Seattle doesn't work as well when we're talking about Ellensburg or Wenatchee. Those techniques have to evolve beyond, and I mean at the pilot level, beyond just what works in the large urban areas. So that would be, I think it would be something that we would expect to see at the NHTSA level when we're funding these large pilot projects and demonstration projects. Look for those that work and can be adapted to. And that includes things like DUI courts. I know, how is little old Chelan going to have a DUI court? They're going to have 5 guys, right? It's not going to work. Not with the current model, but can it be adapted to a circuit judge model? Could treatment work in that kind of a circumstance where treatment is moving around as opposed to in one brick and mortar location? So those are the kinds of, I think, suggestions that I've heard in the past for
Thank you very
addressing
much. I really appreciate you bringing that up. The rural aspect of this is very near and dear to my heart, and we were talking about that this morning. And so thank you for bringing that up. I think that bears mentioning, and again, thank you. That's a specific challenge, resources, the whole gamut, and so that needs some special consideration. So thank you very much. Please.
As an elected official, I couldn't let a lawyer be the last one to speak. Had to have a politician in here somewhere. This has been a really interesting conversation today. I've really learned a lot. As Darren said, I'm a commissioner on the Washington Traffic Safety Commission. One of the things that I really struggle with, and you just brought it up, is the way society looks currently at alcohol. I'm from Walla Walla, and Sunset Magazine just named us in their 2018 awards the #1 best wine place in the United States. So how do we balance that with our responsibility toward our citizens to encourage responsible use of alcohol, and I can't believe I'm going to say this, but I guess responsible use of cannabis as well. At the risk of offending anyone, I wasn't real happy when the governor touted that we have the best pot in the country. I didn't think that was a really good message. And this is a really difficult question, you know. We have beer festivals, and we have, God knows where I live, we have wine festivals now all the time. And I'm sure we're starting to see, I haven't seen it yet, but I'm sure somewhere around the state, we're starting to see cannabis festivals.
Hempfest.
So, Hempfest, thank you. So we've got a lot of work to do in the area of and I'm old school. I mean, it's gonna come from our children. It's just, as I told the Traffic Safety Commission one day when we had a meeting, I have 7 grandchildren, and all of them have to be, well, I have one that just turned 13. He doesn't need any kind of a car seat or anything anymore. He can sit in the front seat. I tried to put him in the front seat before he was 13, and he got mad at me because I didn't know the rules. But I can't drive my grandchildren anywhere without restraining them properly because they won't let me. And I think the answer here is not going to be a short-term fix. This isn't something we're going to fix tomorrow or next year or God knows why. It's going to take time, and I really think we need to look at our youth and our children and look at how we're going to talk to them about this because, you know, this door, you know, the horse is out of the barn, and I don't see how we're ever going to get it back in, so we have to figure out how to deal with that horse at this point. So anyway, I want to thank you all for the input today. It's been, and I know we're not finished, but for me it's been tremendously interesting and educational. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Any other comment, question? Deputy Administrator King, I will turn the closing to you and for the wrap up and for a conversation about next steps and what your vision is. Thank you very much.
Whoa, and this is where I trip and fall. Hello, Internet.
Well, you might as well start to end the day the same way you started.
Strong water I'm drinking. You know, this is a fantastic dialogue. I'm reminded, you know, each time I have the great blessing of gathering, whether it be at the lab this morning or whether it be in another conversation with a small or a large department or a group of dedicated professionals like you talking about this, how much energy and passion there is, how much experience, intelligence, commitment there is to solve the problem. And I'm also reminded that there are 327 million people in this country. I think it's about 260 million people age 18 and older. And how important it is that we not only find solutions together through this dialogue, but that we get our solutions out of this room and out into the communities where it matters. We talked this morning about rural communities, about the challenges of having someone trained in A-RIDE or DRE in a small police department, or getting, you know, backfilling their time, or taking them off the street. I worked in a sheriff's office where we had 2 officers for many shifts. My God, 1 DUI arrest, that would take one of them off the road for half of their shift, right? So you have 1.5 officers for a full shift. Serving rural communities, small agencies, working with EMS, and communicating with drivers so that they can make good decisions, changing societal preferences, changing tolerance of driving impaired. Those are huge tasks. So next steps, you know, clearly we have to raise awareness of the issues throughout our nation. Certainly there's an increased awareness of the availability of various impairing substances. We need to campaign to raise awareness. We have some work that we're doing at NHTSA. I mentioned it earlier, and we look forward, we're now planning in the fall towards a coordinated blitz campaign to raise awareness among drivers, among young people, among teenagers, among young adults, among some of the target audiences who think it's cool to drive high or to drive baked or to drive buzzed, and the people who think they drive better when they're baked high or buzzed. We need to expand the dialogue to include folks who not only have the solutions but need to hear the solutions even when they're hard to hear. And most importantly, we need to take action. It's me, it's you. We have an opportunity right now. As some of you heard me say during the break, we have right now, because of the heartbreaking tragedy of drug impairment in our communities, in around the opioid crisis, we have a rare opportunity in that we have many politicians, community leaders, and others who want to know what they can do to help. So the notes that we're taking here today, we take back, we're devising a plan. As you may have heard me say before, we want to find actions we can take in the near term, start saving lives today by sharing best practices. Educating drivers is one of them. But we also need to find things we can do in the middle term. We talked about sharing and better using the data that already exists as an example, but also writing a vision for the nation, writing what perfect looks like, because if we don't know where we're going, we won't all be rowing in the same direction towards that destination. So we will be working on a draft that I look forward to having to share with you. Next steps in continuing these discussions, next month at the IACP's DRE conference in Nashville. We'll be continuing the dialogue there. I know I'm going to learn a lot. September, we're planning another regional meeting like this in Baltimore. And we will be continuing conversations with other federal agencies, building the awareness, building the alignment, and building coordinated activities. So we're already talking with the White House, Office of National Drug Control Policy. I have at least found some of the folks to reach out to and started to reach out to folks at Health and Human Services, Department of Justice. There are other agencies that care a lot. And quite frankly, the focus right now is what do we do? So we're trying to bucket things near term, middle term, and long term. We've mentioned that there are working groups, the 2 working groups being the state criminal justice system, toxicology and data collection. I think you're absolutely right. There should be more working groups to help communities understand, or folks in communities, how can we get the message out and how can we engage? So we'll take our notes back, we'll put more work into it, we'll post everything here on the website. You know, we're videotaping the event so that the others who wanted to be here and couldn't be here will be able to share in the dialogue here today, learn from it, and expand upon it in our next conversations. For each of us here today, don't be shy. Write to me, write to anyone here, keep the conversation going. I think we all probably interact with one another fairly frequently. I know you both get plenty of emails from me.
Yes.
It's great, isn't it?
It's the first
No,
time.
yeah. So reach out, keep the communication going. Let us know if you see us doing or saying something you don't think is right, because we don't know how, nobody can do this alone. We all have to combine our forces together, combine our intelligence and experience together to combat this deadly epidemic on our highways, save lives, and make sure that, you know, maybe our children will also be struggling with this with us to solve the problem, but maybe our grandchildren won't because of the work here in this room. So thank you very much for your time and dedication today.